we're experiencing a scorcher of
the
a weather.
American West.
The
There is a
conditions
drought
set to
so
last at least
vast
a week.
it stretches from
Destructive winds up to 100.
Could rise by more than 1.5 meters by the year 2100.
How about a round of applause if you enjoyed this video? Yes, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charlene, your MC for this event. Now, the CESG Catalyst 2021 is a lead-up to the CESG 2022, and this is made possible by the following sponsors. And also this very afternoon, I'd like to welcome the Senior Minister of State, Dr. Amy Khor. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give everyone a big warm welcome and thank you for joining us for the CleanEnviro Summit Singapore 2021. Thank you for your presence. Now, the CESG Catalyst 2021, in short, is organized by the National Environment Agency and co-located with Ecosperity Week by Temasek Foundation. CESG Catalyst is a global platform for government leaders, policymakers, regulators, and industry champions to connect, examine, and discover practical solutions to address the environmental challenges of tomorrow. This is also the very first time we'll be presenting it as a hybrid conference where we will have delegates as well as panelists participating in person and also virtually online via the live broadcast for this event. Now, we all know that the global COVID-19 pandemic has presented opportunities to push the global sustainability agenda forward. Now, even as we continue to battle with this public health threat, the existential crisis of the climate change continues to demand urgent action from countries. Hence, the theme for today's CESG Catalyst is Enhancing Sustainable Development in a Pandemic World. Now, in its third edition, this flagship event leading up to the CleanEnviro Summit Singapore next year in April brings together leaders from academia, from government, industry, and the United Nations Environment Programme and World Resources Institute this afternoon. So they will also share with us their vision on how cities can rethink fundamentals and review their plans and goals on taking climate action while preparing for the future public health threats. And this is done via two plenary sessions focusing on distinct but interconnected themes. And right now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest of honor, Dr. Amy Khor, Senior Minister of State, Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment Singapore, for her welcome address. Can we give her a more resounding applause, please? It's been a while since we have a hybrid event, and we are delighted to be here physically. Dr. Amy Khor, please.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and also friends who are here with us virtually. Very good afternoon to one and all, and a very warm welcome to the CESG Catalyst 2021. Since the last CleanEnviro Summit in 2019, we have experienced dramatic shifts in the world, brought about primarily by the COVID-19 pandemic. Even as countries grapple with the unremitting waves of infection, The existential crisis of climate change have not gone away, but commands our collective and immediate action. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, recently released a report which warned that we must embark on urgent, large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, or risk facing even more serious impacts of climate change. In Singapore, we have already witnessed more extreme weather events in recent years, such as periods of intense rainfall that sometimes bring about flash floods. While climate change is a global issue, its effect will vary across geographic regions and populations. With rising temperatures, infectious diseases that thrive in warmer climates, such as dengue fever, will afflict more of the world's populations. And this will pose an even greater risk to public health in Singapore. The consequences of climate change painted by the IPCC must serve as a wake-up call for all nations. Besides accelerating our climate adaptation and mitigation efforts, we need to strengthen regional and global collaboration, as well as partnerships among the people, public and private, or 3P sectors. This would allow us to respond nimbly and robustly in times of crisis. Although Singapore accounts for around 0.1% of global emissions, we are committed to doing our utmost to reduce emissions. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the global trajectory towards achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, as discussed at the UN's SDG Moment event last week. However, it has also provided us with an opportunity to rethink the fundamentals and to renew our push for the global sustainability agenda. We can learn from how we reacted to this pandemic and apply these lessons to the way we approach environmental sustainability and climate change issues. Let me share 3 key areas for change. First, building capability in climate action. COVID-19 has been a force of disruption to countries worldwide. In Singapore, we have had to react nimbly on both the public health response as well as the economic fallout brought about by the pandemic. We were able to respond decisively on both fronts, thanks to our strong public health ecosystem and resilient financial position. Both are competitive advantages that Singapore has built up over decades. Similarly, we must continue to build on the ecosystem of environmental sustainability to develop capability in confronting the generational challenge of climate change. Businesses have an important role to play in building capability to harness solutions such as more carbon efficient means of production and circularity principles in resource management. Ravego Manufacturing Singapore Private Limited, for example, is in the business of plastic recycling and compounding. With a grant from the National Environment Agency's 3R Fund, Ravego set up a washing line at its plant last year to clean the dirty plastics it collected and to turn them into plastic resins. The project can help reduce 6,600 tons of carbon emissions annually by avoiding the incineration of plastics at our waste-to-energy plant, and a further 6,700 tons by displacing virgin plastics. NEA also works with the 3P sectors to co-create solutions to tackle public health and environmental sustainability challenges. NEA recently held the inaugural Illumination, a competition for students to design solutions to improve the cleanliness of our public toilets to minimize transmission of diseases. So illumination is spelled with I-L-O-O. NEA will be evaluating the feasibility of implementing the winning design by Ngee Polytechnic. Second, driving resource efficiency and resilience. Throughout the pandemic, we saw global supply chain disruptions and swift border closures. These disruptions have accentuated the need to strengthen resource resilience, even as we remain open and interconnected with global supply chains. At the same time, companies need to look at how resources can be used more efficiently in an increasingly resource and carbon-constrained world. Sustainable finance is a key enabler to drive resource efficiency and resilience, and an engine for Singapore's growth as a financial hub. The government is leveraging sustainable finance to transform public infrastructure. A good example is the Tuas Nexus, which is Singapore's first integrated solid waste and used water treatment facility. The Tuas Nexus Integrated Waste Management Facility, or IWMF, includes an automated materials recovery facility with higher sorting efficiencies and recovery yields for recyclables, and is equipped with a wet flue gas treatment system to ensure clean air emissions. By harnessing synergies from the Tuas Water Reclamation Plant and the IWMF, Tuas Nexus is expected to result in carbon savings of more than 200,000 tons of CO2 annually, equivalent to taking 42,000 cars off Singapore's roads. NEA recently established a $3 billion multi-currency medium-term note program and a green bond framework to finance sustainable infrastructure developments, such as the Tuas Nexus IWMF. NEA's inaugural launch of 10-year and 30-year green bonds worth $1.65 billion in September was a major milestone. The strong reception to the public sector's first green bond affirmed investors' confidence in Singapore's sustainable development efforts. The issuance of green bonds will help develop green finance markets and support Singapore to become a leading centre for green finance in Asia and around the world. This exciting milestone indeed, is part of our movement towards green growth as outlined under the Green Economy pillar of the Singapore Green Plan 2030, to create jobs, transform our industries, and harness sustainability as a competitive advantage for Singapore. Third, planning ahead for the next crisis. While we look forward to growth and new opportunities, we must continue to plan ahead to remain resilient in the face of new challenges, which undoubtedly will always come our way. Singapore's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was built on lessons learned from the SARS episode in 2003. In addition, our nation was greatly aided by the fiscal prudence of our forefathers and the continued investment in our public health ecosystem. This forward planning placed us in good stead and will allow Singapore to emerge stronger from the COVID-19 pandemic. Our strong and agile scientific capabilities also help us respond quickly to COVID-19. And last year, NEA swiftly initiated a pilot surveillance program to screen wastewater samples for SARS-CoV-2, the causative virus of COVID-19. This has helped with the detection of new COVID-19 cases and allow us to direct swab testing efforts in a more targeted manner. Indeed, we have found this to continue to be very useful in identifying even like potential clusters where it continues to register positive results. The scientific community in the health sector and universities have also collaborated closely to understand and tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. This strong partnership will help us manage future public health crises as well. This pandemic has further underscored the importance of being prepared and to have adequate capacity built up during periods of stability to handle unforeseen crises. While we cannot say for certain when the next environmental or public health crisis will emerge, we can be sure that the effects of climate change and environmental degradation will be felt around the world. Therefore, even as we work to become COVID-19 resilient and prepare for the next pandemic, we must double down on efforts to become climate resilient, build capacity in our environmental sustainability ecosystem, and galvanize action to promote sustainable development. This will give us the best chance of thriving in the new normal. Let me conclude by wishing everyone here a most fruitful discussion this afternoon, and I hope that it will enable the sharing of knowledge, cross-pollination of ideas, and co-creation of solutions with our stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amy Cole. Thank you so much for sharing with us the various initiatives by NEA that's been rolled out for tertiary level, for business as well as community to reduce the carbon footprints as well as to enhance sustainability. Right next, we have come to the first plenary session. So this is on a strategic blueprint for climate resilient cities. So our moderator for this session will be Ms. Jessica Cham. She is the founder and managing director of Eco Business, Asia Pacific's leading independent media and business intelligence organization dedicated to sustainable development. And joining Jessica on stage later on will be Her Excellency Joe Tyndall, New Zealand High Commissioner to Singapore. We also have with us Professor Sira Ramakrishna from the Circular Economy Task Force Chair and Director, Center for Nanotechnology and Sustainability. So let us welcome our moderator and panelists on stage. Let's give them a big round of applause, please. And also joining us virtually online, we have our speakers and panelists, Ms. Dichen Ziring, Regional Director, United Nations Environment Program, Asia and Pacific. And maybe you can wave to everyone here. Yes, let's give a big round of applause. And joining us virtually, we also have Mr. Nirata Samathi, the Country Director for World Resources Institute, Indonesia. Hi. Yes, a very warm hello and welcome from Singapore to you. Thank you for joining us all the way from Indonesia. And now before we begin, we just want to do a check-in with all our guests here present with us. Now, we want to know about your thoughts about the key ingredients for climate resilient cities. Earlier on, I made a voiceover announcement for you to scan the QR code for the Slido. So right now, can you please take out your mobile phones and scan this QR code. Now, the QR code is also found on your table. You may go ahead and scan this QR code. For our panelists, okay, the Slido sticker is on the table as well. You may also take your mobile phone and scan it and let us know your views about what do you think is the key ingredient, okay? So, the key ingredient in effective strategic blueprint for climate resilient cities. So this will go on to form a word cloud. So you can pen in like 1 or 2 words or even a sentence. So the one that will garner the most number of sane response from the crowd, the word gets bigger. So we want to hear from you, which one are the key ingredients? So it seems like right now efficiency is growing, accountability as well. And a down to top approach is one of it. Collaboration becomes huge right now, while really the rest of you think that participation, data, effective planning, and buy-in from all, legislation, commitment, and I would say accountability and collaboration are definitely very close. Okay, a lot of them been voting for that. Long-term urban planning is also one of the key ingredients in effective strategic blueprint for climate resilient cities. Now, is that the true key ingredient? We'd love to hear from our panelists as well as our moderator. Now, as we take a look at our word cloud, of course, a lot of you will have different responses pouring in from all over. I see AI as well. Okay, very interesting. Thank you so much. I think right now, let's take a quick look at the answers that have been keyed in. I think very glaringly in your eyes are collaboration, accountability, and long-term urban planning. Thank you for all your inputs, both virtually as well as in-house with us right now. So I'm going to hand this over to Jessica for the moderation. Jessica, please.
Thank you very much, Charlene, for that introduction. And thank you, CESG, for this opportunity to moderate this very timely and important discussion. Dr. Amy Koh, thank you for your opening remarks and setting the stage for us. And also to our in-person and virtual guests, I would like to encourage all of you to engage with us, whether you are virtual or in person, with our Slido Q&A, which is going to be open later. Now, as we reflect on all the words that have come through here, collaboration, accountability, long-term urban planning, I think the key issue that we really need to think about is how are we going to do it? The recent changing rules on COVID-19 has demonstrated that we are not out of the woods yet of this pandemic. But even as we grapple with this transition towards being COVID resilient, we must not forget the wider, larger effort to be climate resilient, as Dr. Goh had mentioned earlier. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, who actually spoke this week at Ecosperity, has warned that the impact of climate change, if we do nothing, is set to be 10 times the economic damage wreaked by COVID-19. So our topic of discussion today on strategic blueprints for climate resilient cities is a key issue that needs to be high on the agenda for governments and businesses alike. So as the world begins to recover from this COVID-19 pandemic, the clock continues to tick on climate action. And in the lead up to COP26 climate change talks in Scotland in November, all eyes are watching business and government leaders to raise climate ambition and targets. Earlier this year, the IPCC reported that temperatures are rising more quickly than expected, and yet studies have revealed that countries are far behind on climate action. At a forum that EcoBusiness hosted in partnership with United Nations Environment Programme recently, business and government leaders agreed there is much to do in the post-pandemic recovery that can be tied to sustainable development outcomes and in building resilient cities and communities. There was an ADB report recently that highlights that a green recovery is critical for the region to reduce the risk of future pandemics, to mitigate and adapt to the impact of climate change, to create jobs, increase competitiveness, and to meet our sustainable development goals. So instead of framing the climate crisis as one that's just of doom and gloom, I think we should frame this conversation as something of an opportunity. Implementing this green recovery will require mainstreaming environmental and social resilience in policy making and also identifying sources of finance for green growth. I think we can all agree that this needs to be done, but how is the bigger question? Today, I have with me 4 distinguished panelists who will share their thoughts on how COVID-19 has impacted policy making on climate action and the considerations and opportunities that policymakers in the region are exploring to pivot development towards climate resilient cities. All of the speakers have been introduced earlier, so we have a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to dive right in. Thank you, speakers, so much for joining us here today. And High Commissioner, we will start with you. New Zealand is the world's first country to introduce a law to make financial firms report the effects of climate change and has set its sight on being carbon neutral by 2050, which is very commendable. What is New Zealand's plan and national strategy to addressing climate change, and how has COVID-19 impacted them?
Well, thanks, Jessica, and it's really great to have the opportunity to talk today. So I know this is about climate resilient cities, but I'll be speaking on behalf of a country made up of a number of cities. And I think the words that came up on Slido really do resonate with me as well, especially around collaboration and long-term planning. So for New Zealand, a lot of this has been about preparing the ground. This is not something you can rush into. It's really important, and the Paris Agreement helped us to set a long-term goal, that 2050 carbon neutral goal, rather than taking an incremental approach, which we did for a number of years. And taking that incremental approach did not, I have to say, get us very far. If you've set that long-term goal, it allows for policy planning to meet the goal. We know that dealing with climate change requires transformation on an economy-wide scale. So there's an awful lot of policy planning that needs to go into place. There's no silver bullet. Multiple policies are required. So what you talked, I think about mainstreaming, about normalising climate change into policy planning, whether that's at government or at industry level, is super, super important. So you can't manage what you don't measure, and you have to begin with that. And that's something that New Zealand began with. The main policy tool we've had has been our emissions trading scheme, set in place in 2008, to set a price on carbon and allow for offsetting where reducing greenhouse gas emissions can't realistically be achieved. To be frank, for much of the time since 2008 until more recently, the price has been too low to really bend the emissions curve. But we've put in place, over the last year or so, a slew of changes recently, based on science and to be consistent with the Paris Agreement goal of keeping the rise in global temperature to at least 2 degrees and hopefully no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. I'm just going to quickly go through them. So first of all, the Zero Carbon Act you talked about, which is to get to net zero for all greenhouse gases with the exception of biogenic methane from animals, livestock production, where there is a separate target of reducing biogenic methane by between 24 and 47%. We've established an independent climate commission to provide advice to government, proposing 5 yearly carbon budgets and policy proposals for energy, transport, waste, the land sector, the whole economy really. So these 5 yearly cycles have been proposed through to 2035. And the government has until March next year to respond to those proposals. We've promised new nationally determined contribution announcements for COP26 in just over a month's time. And as you mentioned initially, we are about to introduce legislation to make it mandatory for climate risk reporting for financial institutions with over $1 billion rather, in assets. So that's around 200 banks, insurers, financial advisors, etc., etc. We've introduced fee-baits, so-called. So it's a combination of a carrot and a stick to nudge the take-up of electric vehicles and shifting to electric commercial transport for trains and so on. The public service is to go carbon neutral by 2025, and that was in response to our government declaring a climate emergency. We've set up a green investment fund with $400 million capital to invest in green infrastructure. And there I think we'll probably come into a discussion about the importance of a taxonomy to prevent greenwashing. We've invested heavily and continue to do so in an agricultural research, and I'm happy to talk more about that a little bit later, and introduced or will introduce a Climate Adaptation Act in accordance with the Climate Change Commission's recommendations. So I think my key message is that developing policies takes time and needs to be based on science, on very coherent analysis. That then implementation also takes time. But once you've done that, progress becomes exponential. It's not linear. And that's really, really important, because if it was linear, basically we'd all be in a very, very, very perilous position.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. That's really commendable to see all the various initiatives that New Zealand has rolled out, and I'm a big fan of your Prime Minister as well, being very progressive on climate policies as well as climate resilience. I'd like to come back to you on some of the points that you raised, but perhaps before that, we'll go over to Dechen. So we've heard your perspective from one government and a country looking at climate change. And Dechen, you sit with a bird's eye view to the Asia-Pacific region, which are also home to some of the world's most low-lying cities as well as small island states. What is UNEP's assessment of the state of climate action here in Asia-Pacific, and to what extent has it been slowed down or affected by the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Jessica and Ambassador Dr. Amy Koo, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first touch on the global assessment on climate change. UNEP undertakes global assessments covering both mitigation and adaptation. Our flagship reports, the Emission Gap Report, the Adaptation Gap Report, and Production Gap Report. All of them clearly show that actions on climate change mitigation and adaptation are insufficient to achieve the Paris climate goals. So if you look at the UNEP Emission Gap Report, countries need to take a quantum leap in emission reduction. We're looking at globally a 7.6% reduction every year from 2020 to 2030. And failure really to reach these targets, if we don't have mitigation ambition through updated nationally determined contributions, we're going to see temperature increases of more than 3 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. So we know that we need updated nationally determined contributions that must be ambitious and that must set decarbonization targets. In the context of greenhouse gas emissions from our region and commitments under the nationally determined contributions, we're looking at 5 countries, China, India, Japan, Indonesia, and the Russian Federation, that contribute more than 80% of Asia's emission. We know that the governments of China, Japan, and South Korea have proposed increased targets, and we look forward to seeing them in their updated nationally determined contributions. So we know that raising ambitions of these countries are extremely important. As of 24th September 2021, we had 20 countries from this region, Asia and the Pacific, and they submitted new targets. Out of them, we have 6 countries, and we're looking at Australia, Indonesia, New Zealand, Russian Federation, Singapore, and Vietnam. And we did not really see any increase in the ambitions. I really appreciate the presentation earlier on the very ambitious actions being taken in New Zealand. So if we deep dive into some of these nationally determined contributions, what we see are mitigation targets against business as usual scenarios. Some of the reductions include intensity and absolute targets, policies and action-oriented measures, and peaking targets. In terms of sectors, nationally determined contributions have identified energy generation and transmission, transport, building, industry, agriculture, and waste, and forestry as key sectors to reduce greenhouse gases. According to the Emission Gap Report, these 6 sectors have the potential to reduce about 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. A very important fact and something to highlight is 27 countries in our region, Asia Pacific, account for almost 94% of the global pipeline for coal-fired power plants under construction, planned or announced, which is incompatible with the Paris Agreement benchmarks. So when we're seeing some positive news and some momentum in the region, such as Bangladesh and the Philippines have both put a hold on the initiation of new coal-fired power plants, we know we need to do a lot more. So we thought that coal use for power generation needed to peak by 2020. Of course, we have passed that, so we know we need to reduce quickly afterwards, regardless of the region. We know that unabated coal-fired power generation needs to be reduced by 80% from 2010 levels to 2030 and phased out globally before 2040. So we're really looking at a transition, and if we don't see the transition occurring, we're going to see greenhouse gas emissions in our region and globally increase year on year. On your next question on how COVID-19 impacted the region's trajectory on tackling climate change, if I can highlight what we know and some important aspects that countries need to consider. So we know COVID-19 did not slow the relentless advance of climate change. We saw no sign that we are growing back greener, as carbon dioxide emissions are rapidly recovering after a temporary reduction due to the economic slowdown, and we're nowhere close to our reduction targets. We know that the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere continue at record levels, committing the planet to dangerous future warming. The new World Meteorological Organization report, State of the Global Climate 2020, clearly indicated that the extreme weather combined with COVID-19 was a double shock for millions of people in 2020. The pandemic-related economic slowdown failed to put a brake on climate change drivers and accelerating impacts. So cumulative COVID stimulus spent by the Asia-Pacific countries, it's about $5.3 trillion, which is about 32% of the total global spending. And recovery spending was about $1.156 trillion, which was 21.8%. This is a higher rate of recovery spending than the global average of 14.1%. But when we looked at the green recovery spending, it counted for $183 billion, or 15.8% of the Asia Pacific's recovery spending, and this is much lower recovery spending than the global average of 21%. So the COVID-19 crisis offered only a short-term reduction in global emissions. It will not significantly reduce emissions by 2030 unless countries pursue economic recovery that incorporates strong decarbonization. So Jessica, maybe just the fact that when we start to look at nationally determined contributions, many countries are actually talking about the adaptation targets, and there's a lot of work that's going on the adaptation goal. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Darshan, for that overview. And it is, I guess, a long way to go for us in terms of tying our recovery spending to sustainable development outcomes or green outcomes. And I think that that's something that policymakers have to keep in mind. Coming to Prof. Seeram, we've heard from New Zealand, we've heard from Darshan, who's giving the regional view. We can hear from the Singapore view now. You know, PM has called climate change an existential threat to us. And we have articulated a clear roadmap to become low carbon and climate resilient. But how do you think COVID-19 has implemented these plans, and are they sufficient?
Thank you, Jessica. Let me begin by saying apologies to the fellow panelists. I have two reasons for saying that. Reason one, our Minister, Dr. Amy Ko, already explained Singapore plans very well in terms of Singapore Green Plan 2030. That makes my life much more easy. Second one, I'm the only professor. Professors tend to have a thought leadership, broad canvas. That means I have a lesser constraint compared to Joe as well as fellow panelists. That's the reason I say apologies. But never mind, life is not fair for anybody. It's never a level playing field. With that kind of apology, let me walk you through the question Jessica asked me about Singapore's directions and plans towards post-pandemic resilience. The theme of this panel is about building sustainable cities. It's very much related to United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 11. So I believe Singapore is quickly becoming an exemplar for SDG 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities. To walk you through the SDG 11, which is the theme of this particular panel, it underscores that more than half the world population is now living in the cities. By 2050, more than 2/3 of the world population will be moving to the urban areas and cities. The same cities contribute to 70% of the world GDP. They also contribute 70% of the global carbon emissions, and also clearly 2 billion tons of solid waste. It is projected to go up to 3.8 billion tons of solid waste. Singapore is firing twin engines. One is about climate mitigation, other one is about climate adaptation. I'll walk you through what Singapore is doing so that it is more clearer. In terms of climate mitigation, last year Singapore announced Singapore Green Plan 2030. According to that, we will peak our carbon emissions by 2030, and we will reach somewhere half of that by 2050, soon after that, net zero carbon emissions. And there are several policy measures, regulations driving this particular transition. The other one is about adaptation. Singapore is, like, according to, as Deshan said, is one of the countries sharing with other Southeast Asian countries with the low-lying land. And we are keeping an eye on rising sea levels. I was told 10,000 years ago, Singapore was 20 meters. Right now, the sea level has risen by 20 meters last 10,000 years. But more recently, much higher increase because of the global warming. So Singapore looking at future investments of close to $100 billion to mitigate these rising sea levels by protecting our coastlines, starting from more impactful locations, then slowly spreading to the rest of the island. In addition, other challenges associated with climate change are extreme weathers. Many countries in ASEAN experienced flash floods, heavy rains, same as Singapore. So Singapore is taking an approach of source, pathway, receptor, so that we have an integrated approach, applying most advanced technologies like Fourth Industrial Revolution, which means sensors, trying to come up with ways to mitigate that. So I believe these kind of solutions scalable, adaptable for other countries. That's the reason I say Singapore is firing twin engines, in a way becoming exemplar for other sustainable cities and communities. If I have the time, I will go through the other measures we have in place. That involves, if you look at mitigation, involves carbon emissions. Primarily, there are 4 sources of emissions in most countries. One is about transportation. Other one is about industry. In New Zealand case, that would be more about a lot more farming and agriculture, whereas in our case, we have less of that. And then power sector, our electricity supply that drives all our economies. So these are the sectors where we need to pay attention, and Singapore is paying a massive attention to these areas. For example, we are quadrupling our solar energy, and perhaps in the long run, we might import renewable energy from regional countries and faraway countries as well. We're also increasing greening of the buildings. 80% of the buildings are going to be green. Any new buildings that would be built, they would have a much higher efficiency standards. In other words, super low energy buildings is what is the plan to build all these new buildings in the next by 2030. Similarly, we're also transitioning our transportation sector from current heavily polluting diesel and such polluting fuel-based vehicles towards cleaner fuel-based vehicles. So that's how the transportation sector is looked at. And we're also looking at resiliency from the point of a 2030 plan towards meeting 30% of our national food and nutritional goals. So we are promoting urban farming. We're also looking at alternative proteins, synthetic meat. According to the studies, they tend to have a lower carbon emissions compared to the livestock. So I'm sure Joe is already feeling the competition, right, Joe? Yes. Well, I think we are good partners in co-development in terms of the journey towards mitigating climate change together, because I believe, like all other audience as well as co-panelists, no single country can solve the problem. We have to partner with others, and that requires the whole of industry, the whole of country, whole of world approach. So I believe Singapore's current twin engine approach, both on mitigation, adaptation, I think this in several areas would be examples for many other countries in the region and the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. And it reminds me of that word we saw at the start of the panel, which was collaboration. You did a very good job to give a comprehensive overview of Singapore's climate plans. I'm sure MSE is very happy about that. And I will have more tougher questions for you later. But for now, I'd like to ask Nerata to give us his perspective, because the government of Indonesia has updated its NDC, which is great. And it's pledged now to peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. As well as to reach net zero by 2060. What is the government's strategy in terms of achieving these climate targets, and has the pandemic derailed them or accelerated them?
Thank you. Following up a fine example by Prof. Siram just now, in begging for apologies. My apologies that my view is from a CSO think tank perspective, and not representing the government of Indonesia. So yes, just indeed, the government of Indonesia has submitted an updated national climate commitment to the United Nations earlier this month. The submission includes new measures on adaptation and resilience, and some new targets in specific sectors. But as mentioned by Dishan, Indonesia does not raising ambition. It has the same top-line emissions target submitted in 2016, which is an unconditional target to reduce greenhouse gas emission 29% below business as usual by 2030, or a 41% reduction target contingent to sufficient international financial support. So the climate commitment by the government of Indonesia, or NDC, nationally determined contribution, as I said before, includes specific targets on restoration of peatlands, mangrove, and degraded land. So this is quite a new addition, and it is promising because peatlands and mangrove are said to be having a carbon stock which is way above, like for example, tropical forest. 10 to 15 times more. So by focusing on this, I think Indonesia would be able to reduce quite a significant emission. And also, the plan aims at achieving a net zero target at the latest by 2016. Again, at the latest, because by 2030. One important sector in Indonesia, which is forest and use, is planned or having scenario that is going to become carbon sink by 2030. This is also quite ambitious in that sense, but again, it needs hard work. So the new renewable energy that focus on solar, wind, hydrogen, and also nuclear will be the main energy source for us moving towards 2060. This will be complemented by energy efficiency from buildings and others. And of course, electric vehicles for the transportation. I'd like to add one other example on how committed the Indonesia government is, which is on the ocean sector, whereby Indonesia made a bold commitment to reduce marine plastic litter by 70% by 2025. It is 4 years. For short years, if I have to say, in the future, something that is I would say hard to come by. But having an ambitious target is actually drive more collaboration within the government, private sector, as well as CSO. So we are now in a very good progress of reducing the waste on the oceans, and the government actually have to create a new regulation which is already idle in the process for the past 10 years, which is waste retribution. You can imagine that our country hasn't have that yet. It is a very publicly contested kind of regulation actually. But now we have that, and with that, we can improve our waste collection from currently around 36% to around 68% with that. And I think that would create a good effect, not just on waste, but also on emission reduction. So Jessica, you asked me about the COVID pandemic. It has given rise to one of the most challenging global crises of our time. Everyone would agree on that. In Indonesia, the planning ministry launched what we call as a low carbon development report in the early 2019, which then being corrected, if you like, or revised with the coming of the pandemic. So the ministry used a system dynamics modeling approach, and recently adding the COVID kind of aspects, challenges and whatnot into it, and then able to produce what we call as a sustainable growth path, which will deliver higher annual GDP growth than business as usual, of course, and provide more rapid reduction in poverty, together with more than 15 million additional green jobs in 2045. So again, this is also part of the government of Indonesia post-COVID recovery. So in that sense, the numbers shows that it is actually faster than our current NDC. If we go down to this path prescribed by the Minister of Planning. So for us, this is an opportunity to reflect this stronger and more inclusive low carbon and recent growth as they build back better following the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis. Over to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Narata, for that overview of Indonesia's plans. I think, there was a lot to unpack there. We've seen from our panelists, or heard from our panelists, the state of climate action all over the region. And I think that we can all agree that good progress is being made, but more needs to be done. I want to, open this question to all the panelists. And it's a question that actually, Prof, we were talking about just before this panel started. And going back to the title of this plenary, which is Climate Resilient Cities. To what extent does climate resilience mean adaptation versus mitigation? So mitigation is decarbonization, reducing or avoiding carbon emissions, but adaptation is adapting to the effects of climate change. And I know there were some strong views shared, so I think it's quite important perhaps to flesh them out here for our audience as well. Professor, do you want to start first?
Yes, I think since I started, the ball comes here and I must hold the ball. And I think before we started this session, we had a bit of chit-chat among the panel members. It's clear that we did not agree that there is a clear ratio between adaptation and mitigation when we want to define it. While I say that, I do believe mitigation is more far-sighted, whereas adaptation is somewhat what you can call a knee-jerk reaction or trying to put the fire away. So that's kind of an analogy. So now the question is, the world has countries at a different stages of development with the different needs. So some of them probably more well-positioned for adaptation, where some countries probably more positioned for mitigation because they lack the technologies, they lack the investments. And so without investments, scalable technologies, they would not be able to provide a clear reductions in their own targets. So again, we want to clarify. Actually, I took the liberty of asking High Commissioner Joe during the chit-chat session, what's the difference between net zero and carbon neutral? And we hear this again by the countries saying it, big companies talking about them. There's also a bit of confusion. The main thing is, do we need both of them? My answer is yes. Reason is, there are certain sectors of economy in certain countries, probably getting a net zero carbon is difficult, whereas they could do carbon offsets, they could do carbon trading and carbon credits. It provides a platform. So when I look at all these things together, I believe the best way is encourage the cities and urban communities as well as the countries to go through this journey, but see which one they can act faster and then produce tangible results so that the world will be a better place.
Thank you very much, Prof. High Commissioner, I know you have some views on this.
Yes, absolutely. And it is no longer a case of one thing or another, mitigation or adaptation, because climate change impacts are already upon us and mean that countries and cities do already need to take action and develop policies to adapt to the impact of climate change. So there's no set sort of percentage or proportion or whatever, but it's really important for us to remember that the more we mitigate and the faster we mitigate, the less we need to adapt. If we don't do any mitigation at all, basically, I'm going to be a bit crude here and say we're screwed as a planet. And there's study after study that shows that. Mm-hmm. So it is absolutely critical that while, of course, we need to take the urgent action to deal with floods, droughts, fires, and all the rest of it that are already impacting humanity, if we don't spend the money at a government level, at a business level, and take the action even at an individual level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get to whether it's carbon neutrality or carbon zero, then we're in a major, major problem. And no amount of adaptation is going to help us.
Thank you for the strong words there, very relevant and a good reminder that we have to take some urgency to the decarbonization and mitigation part of the piece. Dachen, I'd like to come to you. Around the region, what are some success stories that you've seen of cities striking that correct balance between mitigating and adapting to climate?
Thank you, Jessica. Before I go there, maybe I can talk a little bit, follow up from, Her Excellency and Professor. And if we start to think about resilience, we really have to start to look at the economic, social, and environmental resilience. And I really want to say, since the Industrial Revolution, the global economies followed a really linear model of resource consumption. So we followed a take, make, dispose pattern, and it's a one-way model of production and consumption. So goods are manufactured from raw materials, they're sold, used, then discarded or incinerated as waste. So in this linear system, the limited raw materials will eventually run out, and waste accumulates, either incurring disposal-related expenses or else pollution. So you start to think about manufacturing processes that are inefficient themselves, leading to further waste of natural resources. So this model really makes our economic, social, and environmental systems really more fragile, and this is compounded by climate change. And so when you think of climate resilience, we really need to think of a circular economy model. And we heard that the government of Singapore was doing a lot of really good work in thinking through circular economy. Many countries already developing and implementing circular economy in various sectors to increase their resilience. And so what countries have done, there's been a number of policy development efforts that aim to harmonize economic, environmental, and social goals that are being put in place. At the government level, we've already heard about, the Sustainable Development Goals. And here, circular economy principles and practices result in more resource efficiency and less waste. But also what some of the countries are now starting to look at is natural resource accounting, looking at the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. So the correct value is put. I mean, where do we account for air pollution? And we've started to look at countries where they've started to think about, how they look at things like responsible consumption and production, how they integrate, they internalize the externalities of pollution, how they strengthen policy initiatives for material and energy efficiency, and investments in green sectors such as renewable energy, low carbon buildings, eco-efficiency of heavy industry and public transport. What we're seeing across is that many countries are doing, there's a lot of good examples, a lot of good pilots. There's, some good policy tools of sustainable consumption and production, but they're not coming together. They're not contributing to a circular economy. So we need to align and integrate these tools effectively. And in countries where policy development has progressed, we still see that implementation is lacking due to gaps in funding, human resources, institutional arrangements, and the lack of effective tools. So maybe, Jessica, what I'm saying is there's a lot of really good work, and I think starting to think about integrating circular economy principles and practices into national development policies is going to be really important. But there's been a lot of really good pilots on building resilience. We've heard of many good practices, but it's not a whole of society, and it's not at a scale where we're able to see a transition to effective low carbon transition. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dachen, for helping to remind us that the circular economy model is central to being resilient and that huge interlink between circular economy and climate change. Narata, do you have any examples perhaps from Indonesia to share that kind of exemplifies climate resilience in terms of mitigation and adaptation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Before I share with you a bit on the example, I'd like to add something here on cities resilience, building on what Professor Siran has mentioned just now. I think each country, I think Her Excellency also mentioned about this. Every country would have different ways to approach a climate crisis, be that concentrate more on mitigation or adaptation, or a combination of both in a different proportion, if you like. But to me, based on the recent COVID-19, that really something that hasn't been thought of by any country. And we happen to be able to use system dynamics modeling to see how this is affecting the sectors and whatnot. We understand that within the urban setting, actually including the informal sector in urban planning, the long-term urban planning is one of the keywords in the cloud that we have found earlier on. is actually important because the impact of the COVID actually happened or felt really bad by the poor in the urban setting, and that is because we don't. I mean, in Indonesia, we don't have a system that could support this informal sector. So therefore, having that in supported by our system as part of the adaptation would certainly create a better and more resilient cities. Jessica, on the example, the government of Indonesia tried to, let's say, mainstream the adaptation action through, more kind of educational drive. So far, we have around 3,000 climate villages, which have been set up by the government as an example, to accelerate adaptation at the ground level, in which climate literacy, risk management, and society preparedness are being enhanced. And also on the different entity, which is on conservation, forest conservation, under CBD commitment, the government is adding more areas of conservation and allow the build up of a better ecosystem, which then able to support more economic resiliency and also social and livelihood resilience. So I'll stop there. Over to you, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Narata. At this point, yes, Commissioner, go on.
Sorry, if it's all right, I was just prompted by comments from Deshan that I thought were really important. And that was around this idea that we've lived for decades imagining we're in a world of limitless natural resources, and we've only recently realized we are not. We very much are not, and we do have to live and think, produce, consume in different ways, the circular economy. I wanted to refer to things at three levels, because we are talking about the how in this session. So one thing that has become important in New Zealand is in looking at the way Māori conduct business. One of the very important values that Māori adhere to is in the native language, kaitiakitanga. Kaitiakitanga stands for or means stewardship. It means caring about the land, the planet, and the people just as much as you do profits. And that becomes a driving motivation for business. At a government level within New Zealand, a couple of years ago, New Zealand government introduced the concept of a well-being budget. So to do that, they identified 5 priority areas with a broader definition of outcomes that do look well beyond GDP growth in terms of economic success, to define success both in terms of social and environmental outcomes as well. Then you can see that at a business level as well. Increasingly, you're seeing shareholders starting to make demands to put pressure on businesses to deliver results, not only in terms of dividends, but also to report and take their investment and policy decisions on the basis of ESG. I agree with Deshan, it is not exactly widespread yet, but it is growing. And taking that holistic view whether you're running a country or a business or operating as an individual, is super important, I think.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Very, very well said. And I think stewardship really is key here when you think about the responsibility that we have in terms of how we manage our resources and how we do long-term planning, which was one of the words that came up at the start. I'd like to encourage everyone now to perhaps ask your questions with the Slido QR code that was flashed earlier, and I think it will be flashed up again. And you can send in your questions for our panelists, and I will field them. But I want to perhaps, ask Commissioner your question, because as we were speaking, I realized that the one actor missing among our panelists is business. And we know that we can't possibly achieve climate resilience without business. And with your plans, your national initiatives, it has demonstrated how climate change really is an issue that requires government intervention. But not all businesses are open to that. I mean, look around the world in terms of how much fossil fuel subsidies we still give out, how much national and corporate interests are still, slowing down climate action as well as policies. What is kind of like I wouldn't say silver bullet, but what are one of the effective ways to get businesses on board, to understand that, these policies are needed and they do need to implement these targets?
That is, I think, a really good question. And one of the things that I really noticed as a former climate change negotiator was that we should not underestimate the impact and the importance of the Paris Agreement. What the Paris Agreement did was sent a very powerful political signal to business around the world that governments meant business, that they fully intended to make that economic transformation that would take us to a low-carbon economy. That political signal resulted in many businesses deciding to shift the basis on which they were making their long-term policy and investment decisions. And in New Zealand, for example, we saw the development of a so-called Climate Leaders Coalition, accounting for, I can't remember exactly what percent, but I think it was well more than half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. I have a feeling it might even have been nearly as high as 80%. So by creating that coalition, they sent a strong signal out that they were determined to look across their entire value chain and look to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce the impact of carbon. Now, of course, that doesn't apply across the board. In some ways, it's easier for larger businesses that have got the resources, the human resources and the capability to do that kind of thinking and put strategies in place. Much more difficult for SMEs, for example, to make transition. But frankly, you have to start somewhere. And I think that mutually reinforcing sense of government sending policy signals, of businesses hearing from the public that they value ethical, environmental and socially responsible decision-making, kind of works from both ends to slowly and gradually encourage businesses to take action. I mean, one last example, I guess, is a country like Saudi Arabia, which is, as we know, heavily reliant on the production and export of fossil fuels, and spent a long time in the United Nations climate change negotiations really trying to stop anything too much from happening, because frankly it was not in the country's economic interest, but gradually over time decided that it couldn't prevent the inevitable, that the combination was too much and it needed to take this into account. So instead, it has developed a 2030 plan to diversify its economy and to reduce its reliance on on fossil fuels. A new term developed, which has gained traction, called just transition, a just transition. And that is super important for governments and businesses to be thinking about how they can help businesses and affected communities and workers to pivot to new ways of earning a living, of making money that are less bad on the environment than a reliance on fossil fuels.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I mean, perhaps I can provide the business perspective, sitting on a few boards and engaging with them. This just transition is very relevant to the conversation, and I think a lot of the reasons that the businesses, give for not accelerating perhaps this transition is costs, and that there are livelihoods that depend on massive operations such as, say, mining or, the fossil fuel industry, and that this transition needs to take place in time. But I suppose the message here also is that we don't have time. So, Professor, perhaps I can come to you, because obviously you engage with such a wide section of stakeholders. What can we do to accelerate this transition and get businesses on board when policy needs to happen, instead of them lobbying against policy to happen, to take place?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. My interactions with the captains of industry gives me the feeling two things are driving their minds most of the time. One is the regulations, because these corporations, they're either nation-bound or across the multinational, they seems to respond to the regulatory framework. So, as Joe mentioned, strong signal from the governments is very helpful. So if that can be backed up with a clear regulatory frameworks, that would definitely encourage them. Second one is most corporate leaders are right now driven by the investment capital, which is again driven by the short-term returns. That's where what you alluded to, the cost aspect, would not get normally factored in. And a classical example is fossil fuel industry, for example. There's a lot of costs, social costs associated with the fossil fuel energy, but somehow that has got dissipated as the last 50 to 100 years. Everybody adopted using the fossil fuel energy, but still they haven't paid attention to the social costs. It's almost taken as it is a subsidy given. So by changing regulatory side as well as stakeholders, primarily the investors, they get the signal. And also that's where you actually handle the cost factor. But I like to say one more thing. While we always say finances and regulations are important, we are not recognizing most of the CEOs of the companies are in their age 40s and 60s, except probably the what do you call digital companies. They tend to be a bit of a lower age. So when these people went to the universities and got the education, there is no sustainability education. There is no circular economy concepts Deshing mentioned. There is no biodiversity conservation laws or the single-use plastics, what Coney said. None of these were actually topics of in the curriculum, neither they were taught. So I believe in addition to finance, regulation, we have to deepen the sustainability education to the corporate leaders, to the policymakers, as well as the public, so that fundamentally we are changing the culture. Once we change the culture, the values will come. That's where we all alluding to stewardship, the example Joe has mentioned. The stewardship comes because there is a value system. The value system is driven by the culture. Culture needs to be changed by education. So that's where I just go towards saying that we should support three aspects. One is financing these scalable solutions. Second one, regulatory environment should be more transparent, open, easy to understand and implement, backed by deeper sustainability awareness and education.
Thank you.
Couldn't agree more on the education one, but also add that you can teach an old dog new tricks, being an old dog myself.
Thank you very much, both. Darshan and Nirata, any thoughts there?
Maybe Jessica, I will come in and I will say, I think, High Commissioner talked about the emission trading scheme. And I think we really have to start to look at putting a price on carbon. And I know that Singapore's already implemented a carbon price, and Vietnam's passed a law to develop national carbon markets. But we have to think about a regional, a regional market. I mean, this must be something, when you look at the Paris Rule Book, that we must be able to look at. You start to think of the EU border carbon tax that's being discussed to incentivize private sector. So when we start to look at incentives, that's important. Regulation is important. But many countries under the climate regime, they have decades of data. Greenhouse gas inventory sources and sinks. And I'm surprised when I start to go to the same countries and I talk to ministries of planning, to ministries of finance, they don't know anything about this data. So I think we really have to start to look at the data. We start to look at which are the heavy emitting sectors, what are voluntary incentives, so both voluntary and regulatory measures, what are the changes, and I think we have to then start to focus on a few areas. I mean, we can start to look at transport sector. It's one of the main contributors to growing energy demand. We look at 25% of global carbon emissions from fuel consumption in 2018. We look at passenger vehicles, freight vehicles, aviation, shipping, rail. So, I mean, there are clear areas where if we can all come together. But I've been really keen on getting, the data, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, national communications, biannual update reports that governments produce, and getting sort of that information out in a more public domain. And so maybe, High Commissioner Joe, maybe the climate negotiations have become so complex, we're not able to mainstream it, and we've got to take it out if we're going to be able to really make the transitions and the transformations that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darshan. We've got questions starting to come in now, and some very interesting ones. Narata, perhaps I can pose the first one to you, and that is really, if we look at the global response to COVID, including the fragmentation where comes to the global vaccine equity, how do we realistically expect the global community to come together for climate change if we can't even do so for vaccines? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, sure. And I think Prof. Siram already answered that. Letting people get involved, understand what it is, what is the consequences, what is the reason and the science behind it, is the most important thing, not just for COVID, but also for climate change. So that is actually what we are heavily doing now in my organization at WFI, to educate and inform people so that they can make an informed decision on almost anything, including whether to get vaccine or not, or vote on the political leaders and whatnot. And that is the approach also being taken by the Minister of Planning in this case, with the Low Carbon Development Initiative. Yeah. So this LCDI, as we call it in Indonesia, it is an exercise, as I said before, using system dynamics, whereby for the first time the government of Indonesia put into the system, the calculation and the model, the limitation of resources, the deforestation, depletion of minerals, oil, and so forth, So for the first time, we are able to correct the macroeconomic trajectory with this limitation. And immediately we corrected the economic growth to something which is more realistic. I mean, of course, this is a model. And then put that model into something that the public can access and play with. So the public can, choose a prescribed scenario if you like. How about if we, expand our rice field through food estate initiative, for example? What will that affect the energy sector? What that will affect the other sectors and environment? What if we decided to, deforestate more to open up for palm oil, for example, because that is our big state revenue? What would happen? So those kind of prescribed scenario is there putting within the system so that people would understand and then able to make decision whether to support a regulation, whether to question, whether to put forward a right question, appropriate question to the government, or even the journalists would start to look into and investigate something. All in all, is trying to create more understanding, better understanding on what is climate crisis. In your question, Jessica, the COVID vaccine. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Narata. I think that deep understanding is an important point to make, and Prophet's mentioned about the role of education. There's an interesting question here from Paul Lee, and perhaps, High Commissioner, I could ask you this one. What kind of backup programs can countries collaborate on to absorb climate refugees? Because this is actually a topic that is often spoken about, and how in extreme weather events or when we bear the brunt of climate change effects, we're going to see lots of climate refugees. Is that something that governments are prepared for?
Yes, before answering that, I just want to say one thing in response to that first question, and that is whether the international community can come together successfully, collectively. As someone who was deeply involved in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, I say absolutely yes. The world has already come together collectively to work on climate change, and has agreed through the Paris Agreement to reflect every 5 years on how far they have come and promise to do more, both in terms of their own actions, but also from developed countries promise to do more in terms of providing climate finance to support developing countries in their mitigation and adaptation. So that's a quick addition to the first question. To the second question, yes, the issue with climate refugees or climate migration, as I think we more often call it, is a tough one. And it's something we in New Zealand are certainly paying a lot of attention to, because there are a number of very low-lying Pacific islands, and we feel a personal responsibility for islands in the South Pacific to do whatever we can to ensure their future. People from those islands see migration as very much a last resort. This is not their preferred solution, not something they want to race to until and unless all and every other option has been exhausted. I think it's also important to remember that migration does not necessarily mean going to another country. It can mean needing to relocate within a country. And some of the other measures we certainly have been looking at to put in place is to make sure that where there have been natural disasters, it's not a case of simply rebuilding, it's building back better, stronger, thinking as we invest in infrastructure in those countries about making sure we do so in ways that mitigate the impacts of climate change, higher roads, airports, more robust buildings, things like that. But definitely, we will have to take into account and think very carefully about what options there are. And I think a former leader of Kiribati, for example, said what we want is migration with dignity. If it comes to that, that's what we want. And so that is a message we as a government have taken to heart and would be wanting to ensure we could help, particularly focusing on our part of the world. But very much as a last resort and very much looking for other solutions that allow communities to stay where they live, or at least close to where they live.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for that very thoughtful response. Dachen, I wondered if you wanted to add on that, because climate refugees must be an issue top of your mind.
Thank you, Jessica. Actually, I visited Fiji, where we had investment from Kiribati. And this was the first time when we started to look at countries actually thinking about the future. There's a lot of work that's being done in terms of risk insurance. I know in the Caribbean there's been work done, in Africa there's been work done, and I think there's been some interest in Asia and the Pacific to look at some of this work in terms of risk insurance. I think High Commissioner has put this, I don't really think I have much more to add, just that I think one of the, maybe COVID-19, the pandemic taught us two things. I think it brought home the reality of the kind of risks, a zoonotic disease, and something, we've talked about keeping the wild and talking about wet markets. But suddenly, the risks of climate change have become more evident to policymakers and to decision makers. I think the other aspect was with air pollution, where the first time people saw mountains, that it is possible. So I think the IPCC, the special 1.5 degree report, actually tells us there's a timeline for us to take action. So I think that must be the message going forward. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dachen. There's a question that's come in on the carbon tax, which I want to pose to Professor. And obviously, it's an issue that we've studied here, and there's a lot of debate as to how much that carbon tax should be. Is it enough to galvanize large-scale transition or the switch to low-carbon technologies?
Well, just to give a numbers, Singapore introduced 2019 $5 per metric ton of CO2, and that covers nearly 80% of the major carbon emission sources in Singapore. And there is also other number out there in European countries. They are talking about further increasing under the ETF scheme towards upwards close to $100. So there is a deeper conversation that's going on. What is the appropriate amount of carbon tax? I have to disappoint that carbon tax is not a silver bullet. If we just say we increase the carbon tax, the world will be, takes care of itself. I think we are a little bit short-sighted. The reason is carbon tax only gives a signal to the industry leaders as well as communities or cities that we have to pay attention to the carbon emissions because they have a knock-on effects, social costs, health effects, as well as the climate change eventually causing extreme weathers. But the right way to do is help them to think in a direction These are the business innovations, technology innovations, social innovations they must adopt. So for me, one need to encourage them to look at, in the future, these taxes will be even higher, not in the form of carbon tax, but social costs that would be attributed back to whoever is marketing products, making the products, or mining the resources. So carbon tax should be understood as it's a necessary policy tool, but using that as a single silver bullet would not fundamentally change the industry. Rather, I would give an example. There are certain sectors, they may not be able to achieve net zero emissions because of the way they do the functioning. For them, probably a combination of carbon tax and carbon offsets and carbon credits supported by a carbon trading platform, which is what Singapore is trying to do. Singapore Stock Exchange is now actively pushing towards a carbon trading platform. But for that to be successful, there must be high quality carbon offsets, there must be high quality carbon credits. And when I say quality, that has to be backed by transparency. Somebody can independently verify the information. That requires international standards where there is a commonality, the standards are interoperable and easy to understand by different segments of that particular value chain. So I believe conversation should be, what else should we do in addition to carbon tax so that we can genuinely help the industry, societies, what we call sustainable cities, because every human being on planet Earth, they all want to live happily. And happiness is, of course, very difficult to define it, because I'm a professor, right? So obviously, a little bit philosophical. So while we don't quite understand happiness deeply, but we all understand wellness. To have good wellness, everybody aspires it, every individual, every human being. So no matter which level of income group they come along, they all want to be happy. That means they want to be better well-being. So I think it is the responsibility of human beings, well-being of others. That means we must help them to think, in addition to carbon tax, there are a few other things every country, every city, every community should do it, so that I think then we will fundamentally make more people happy. I just want to add on to what others discussed about refugees. Of course, I'm not a social scientist, neither an expert on refugees, whereas other panel speakers are much more into that. But I thought, if I look around the world, I do not think there is enough investments in terms of the refugee fund. So maybe it's time the world thinks about growing that refugee fund, so that wherever such things happen, the world can tap into that, like something like what they created World Bank many years ago. Right now, it is doing a wonderful job. And so there must be another financing tool for such a refugee migration. But it is also said that refugees should be understood within the country, migration, across the countries. Now the question is, how do we link this to climate change? My belief is, as other speakers said, circular economy. The circular economy 101 is, the closer the circle is better for climate change mitigation and adaptation. That means you are talking about all the resources are circulated as close as possible. That means the refugees can be integrated towards adopting where they can facilitate closer, tighter circular economy. For example, food and nutrition requires lots of manpower or human capital, like other sectors as well. So one could start thinking about certain sectors where this international fund could fund it, supported by these organizations, philanthropies, who can back certain technologies and innovations, so this might happen. So it's kind of a bit of techie kind of answer.
Thank you, Prof. I think you're the only person who can go from carbon tax to happiness, but that is, thank you for those insights. I just wanted to add on that carbon tax point, actually, that, it has to be a mix of incentives and penalties that will get businesses, on board with the targets. And if you look at the EU cross-border tax adjustment, which Deshan had mentioned just now, it's a region that's basically going to level the playing field, whether you like it or not. So if you want to export your goods to EU, you have to actually take into account what is the carbon footprint in your goods and the services that you're providing. Even if your domestic country doesn't tax you on the carbon, you are going to be taxed by the jurisdictions in which you do business in. And I think that businesses do have to keep that in mind, that even if regulation is lacking in their home country, that doesn't mean that that's going to enable them to be competitive on the international stage. So I just wanted to make that point. And with that eye on the time, I'm going to combine the last question here from our audience with my own last question for all of you as we wrap up this really insightful discussion. And the question from our audience here really is that climate change is still relatively removed from day to day, being a long-term problem, even though we've seen some very visible warning signals recently. It is not as visible as COVID-19. I mean, the fact that we're all sitting here wearing masks is a visible reminder of the pandemic. What can we do to, I suppose, make climate change feel a lot more real so that we can take an action on it? And it's related to my last question for all of you, which is, what do you consider to be the most effective business or policy action that would help us to be truly climate resilient? And Narata, I will start with you.
Thank you, Jessica. It has been that $1 million question to anyone, including my organization. So, therefore, for WRI Indonesia, our vision is actually to educate more people on this issue, so that everyone would then collaborate in a wider sense towards the same direction. So we realize that for some it is drive us to more frustration than not, and you can see that even in Indonesia we now have Extinction Rebellion, kind of movement, the one that's being started in the UK. Now we have that. But if you try to look at the apostle that they are holding on, the words that they're using and whatnot, it's actually quite remote and removed from the everyday people on the street. Yeah. So to me, the question of making it easier to understand is the challenge that we face. Yeah. We have the science, we have it all, we can use modeling and whatnot, but it is really a challenge to get the message, to get the knowledge and the message across, not just to the lay people on the street, but also to the parliament members, whereby they're the one who would have a great say in developing our regulation that would support our future development towards more low carbon pathway. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Narata. Deshan?
Thank you, Jessica. Jessica, what I would say would be really that we start to look at financial flows, really look at climate-related risk disclosure. Where do the banks put the money? Where do pension funds put their money? And we really start to look at, what we really start to, if we can look at the financial flows to a climate resilient and a low carbon future. And this is all there in the Paris Agreement. So I think the Paris Agreement is extremely powerful, but if the focus can be on financial flows and climate related risk disclosures, if we can bring this, I think this will be quite powerful. One of the challenges of climate change is that it affects every sector. I mean, we are facing, extreme weather events, but it affects agriculture and, infrastructure and transport and energy. So it isn't that you can focus on one sector. It is so complex. But for me, I think if we can focus on financial flows, I think this will take us further. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Dachen. Just follow the money. I think that's very important. Thank you for that. Prof, over to you.
Yeah, I tend to think this way is root of the problem is all the societies became over-parenting. It means if you look at the example given by the rural example by Excellency Jo, she said the rural communities value the nature much more. So if you compare that with the urban community, what exactly happened is all the countries around the world, communities, or the city governments, they are doing over-parenting. In other words, people outsource the climate-related issues to the leaders. So to reverse this one is very difficult. The way forward, I believe, is we must start valuing green, climate, sustainability-related efforts by the individuals within the organization, within the community leaders, governments, as well as the society. Either you value them or you give them certain benefits, so that becomes a kind of cultural of some kind of income coming, so that they go by running their own family. So that means it became so organized compared to 50 years ago. So we cannot reverse it. The only way is we can build on it. That means this organized sector need to have an element recognizing that if you do anything related to sustainability, climate change, or green pursuits, you are recognized, you are valued, you are much better citizen of the community. That would be the change.
Thank you, Prof. So we really need to empower the individual here. And last but not least, High Commissioner, you have the last word.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think well, two parts. So first, in terms of the question, I've noticed that, well, I mean, we know the evidence is everywhere. There's wildfires in many parts of the world, there's droughts, there's floods, and there is media reporting on that. I think I have noticed that the Straits Times, for example, is really putting a great deal more focus on climate change, with a couple of pages devoted to that, or to biodiversity or related subjects in every edition of the newspaper. Perhaps some thought could also be given to the kind of readily digestible graphs. You get the IPCC reports coming out very infrequently, but more readily digestible graphs that could be included to give people that sense of what is happening in the real world. In terms of effective action, I've got a few quick things to give as my kind of recipe. One is to remember that it's a collective issue, and it applies at all levels, to governments, to cities, to individuals, to businesses, etc. It's really important to secure bipartisan political support for consistent and stable policies. Less relevant, so perhaps, given the situation here in Singapore, but we've seen wild swings in policies in one or two other countries that I won't name. It's really important to normalise or mainstream the climate change issue across the whole economy and across supply and value chains. Recognise that it brings opportunities for innovation, high-tech solutions, new areas of work, and capitalise on those opportunities. Dachen has referred a couple of times to getting the price right, whether that's in terms of putting a price on carbon or getting rid of the price distorting or consumption distorting subsidies that are there on fossil fuels. I think, finally, the most important thing is to show there are solutions now at all and every level, big and small, so that everybody at every level can contribute. If it's all a doom and gloom message, then the natural human tendency is to pull the covers over our head and say, just want it to go away. So it's being able to identify those solutions and help people get along with them.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. On that very positive note, I'd like to thank all our panelists for such a wonderful discussion. There were many questions that came in right at the end. I think people were just getting warmed up, so apologies that we can't reach all that questions, but I think we've had a really deep conversation about everything from regulation to carbon taxes, happiness to circular economy. And in reality, I think, there are so many elements that go into building a climate resilient city, and there's still a lot of work to be done. So for today, I hope we've provided you some food for thought to take into your personal lives and your professional lives as you think about how we can all really play a part, whether personally or professionally, in building climate resilience. So please join me to thank all our panelists for this really interesting discussion, and I'll hand over the time back to Charlene. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and also join me to give Jessica a big round of applause as well. Thank you for moderating. Yes, it has been an excellent sharing and also insightful discussion, both online as well as offline and here on site with us. Okay, so we're going to go for a short break, and we just want to share with all of you who's online with us. We'll see you back about 3:30 Singapore time for the plenary session 2 to commence. Okay, so we will see you back in a while. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us back for the second plenary session. And this is Shanlene. And once again, welcome to the CESG Catalyst 2021. Now, of course, for this second session, for our delegates, if you're here with us on site as well as online, we just want to highlight to you that you could scan the QR code for the Slido questions later on. And for our delegates here on site with us at MBS, we'd like to invite you to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. Thank you. And of course, this second plenary session, we have the topic on building resilience against public health threats. And our moderator for this afternoon is Ms. Gloria Tan, and she is the Executive Director of Public Hygiene Council. And joining Gloria on stage with us, we have Mr. Chu Ming Fai, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, Public Health, and Director General, Public Health, National Environmental Agency. And right beside him, ladies and gentlemen, we also have with us Professor Teo Ik Yin, Din, Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health, National University of Singapore. Last but not least, on site with us, we have Mr. Tony Tree, President, Environmental Management Association of Singapore. Please join me in giving our moderator as well as panelists a big round of applause, please. And now, of course, joining us virtually online, let's take a look at our panelists. We are pleased to have with us Mr. Joseph Nazareth, Head of Group Health, Safety, Environment and Quality and Corporate Responsibility, ISS. Would you like to wave to everyone? A big round of applause, please, for Mr. Nazareth. And we're also delighted to have with us this afternoon, joining us online, Ms. Lauren Mikhailov, Oceania Manager, International Sanitary Supply Association. A big wave to her and a big round of applause. Thank you. All right, so folks, right after lunch, I know the environment's a little conducive, good food, and before you slip into food coma, we just want you to work your fingers as well as your brains a bit, okay? We'd like to pick on your brains. We will have a quick Slido, and that's where we want to check in with all of you here. Who do you think should be responsible for a cleaner and healthier city? So please take out your mobile phone right now to scan this QR code. Just a gentle reminder for our panelists on stage with us, the Slido QR code is by the side of your table, so you can take your mobile phone, scan the QR code, and join us in participating in the Slido game together, okay? So who do you think is responsible for cleaner and healthier cities? Is it me? Is it you? Is it everyone? The community, the schools, the government? Whichever agency that you probably think should be the answer, just share with us. Now, on site, for all our delegates, you may also scan the Slido QR code that's found on your table. For those of you who's watching us online, virtually, live broadcast, please go ahead and scan this QR code and type in your answer. We'd just like to pick your brains a little this afternoon. Do let us know, who do you think is responsible for a cleaner and healthier cities? So I do see a lot of ones say everybody, individual, regulators and individual. Some say me, some says everyone, with leaders, so all of us. And someone say every living thing. Yes, that's a very cute answer over there. And businesses. And I think all of you would unanimously type in this. It says everyone. So every one of us seems to have a unanimous vote from all of us here online as well as virtually on offline, who's joining us here and participating in the Slido. Okay, so I guess, yep, the answer is everyone is responsible for a cleaner and healthier cities. Not just you, not me, but just really everyone. So this is a food for thought for our moderator as well as our panelists here with us this afternoon. So Gloria, I'm going to hand over the second plenary session to you. So a round of applause please once again for moderator as well as our panelists. Let's kickstart this session. Right, so can we on the mic for Gloria? Would love to hear her lovely voice for this afternoon. Would you like to try the mic? Okay. Would you like to, let me see whether it's on for you. Okay, maybe say a few words. Can we have another mic? Because I can't share my mic with her for hygiene reasons. Yes. All right, how about the panelists? Maybe we'll just try with you.
Testing.
That's
okay.
good.
Testing.
That's good.
Testing.
All right, we're here from all the guys. Just a lovely lady. Okay, there you go. Let me on this for you. Okay, it's on? Yeah.
Thank you, Charlene.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for everyone for joining us today at CESG Catalyst Plenary Session 2. I'm Gloria Tan, your moderator for this session. So today's session is about building resilience against public health threats, which focuses on public hygiene and cleanliness, and on the development of a prepared and resilient ecosystem against public health threats. So this cannot come at a more pertinent time as now, as we continue to battle the ongoing pandemic, which has actually heightened our awareness on the need for high standards of public cleanliness and hygiene, which happened to be our first defense against COVID-19. So I have our esteemed speakers today who bring with them a lot of experience with their professional backgrounds. So I welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. So let's dive straight into the topic. And I would like to start off by asking, how has COVID-19 impacted the concept of clean and cleaning? And will these evolve or rather will it actually impact policy making to safeguard public health and hygiene in the new normal? So maybe I can start with Ming Fai first.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria. Firstly, I would like to express my great pleasure to be physically present in this venue together with all of you and my fellow panelists and virtual panelists joining us from overseas. I think that it is a real achievement for us to have people come this far to be able to gather here like that. So very happy to be here. Now we speak about the COVID-19 as a new normal, but in reality, pandemics of such nature are not new to human society. Right? You have coronavirus, you have the bubonic plague, you have Spanish flu, you have yellow fever, malaria, and all these are diseases that over the course of history has plagued mankind. Very often you'll find that the key to resolving these pandemics is really in prevention. Public health prevention measures has probably saved more lives by preventing people from getting sick or ill in the first place than medical science have actually cured people of these illnesses, right? So this can be in the form of putting in place better sewage infrastructure, draining swamps, preventing vectors from breeding. So it's really no different this time round for us to be able to handle this pandemic effectively. And of course, we always talk about how then that would position us for future pandemics. The first is really prevention. How do you prevent the threat of the disease from spreading in the community? As we all know, public hygiene really is a hygiene factor in the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? So it's really something that we all have to do. And one of the things at the policy level that I think we were quite fortunate to be able to roll out last year was the environmental sanitation regime. Essentially, even before the COVID-19 crisis, what happened in 2018 and 2019 was that we saw a spate of gastroenteritis outbreak in our childcare centers. And because of that, we actually went on a policy review to kind of figure out what is it that we need to put in place as a policy lever to up the standard of cleanliness and hygiene in Singapore. So we rolled out the environmental sanitation regime last year by passing an act in Parliament to amend the Environment Public Health Act to say that under the ES regime, premises owners in locations where there are immunocompromised individuals or high footfall. So for example, childcare centers, the elder care facilities, schools, hawker centers, markets, these will be premises where we will roll out the environmental sanitation regime this year to essentially have the premises owners come on board with the government agencies to tackle the problem upstream. So we have conducted over 20 sessions with various partners to establish what are some of the cleaning standards that needs to be put in place, what needs to be cleaned, how frequently they need to be cleaned, and we'll work to identify then who are the people that can be trained on site to help us with this ES regime, right? What we call the environmental control, ECCs, right? So the ECCs essentially will be there, trained to help us with the ES regime protocols. And at the same time, we will also hold the premises owners responsible for cleanliness of the premises. So essentially, that's the prevention part of it. We have covered trained about 230 ECCs to date, and environmental control coordinators to date, and then we'll be aiming to roll out to about 3,000 premises by March next year. So this is a prevention tool, policy tool that we have put in place in response, actually in anticipation of a pandemic like COVID-19, except that we didn't expect it to hit us at such a scale. But the co-regulatory approach is something that I think we will continue to work with the industry on to make sure that the policy frameworks are in place. Now, failure to prevention then means that we have to have backup contingency plans, and what that means is really the ability to detect the virus early, to be able to react quickly, and to be able to control it confidently. So some of the things that we saw last year, when actually I remember COVID reached our shores in February. This was actually the eve of Chinese New Year Eve. I still remember getting a call from the Ministry of Health informing me that there is a COVID case in Singapore, Sentosa Hotel. And arising from that, we were quite lucky because the protocols we had in place then were to deal with Ebola virus. So you can imagine dealing with Ebola virus, very deadly, and also highly contagious. The PPE that they required us to wear actually was very, very high. The level of protection that we had to give to our cleaners, and the protocols were also very stringent. But unbeknownst to, I think, many people, is that we had actually a monkeypox case that occurred in Singapore the year before. And when the monkeypox came to Singapore, we actually adapted from the EVD protocols, stepped it down a little bit, and then got the engine warmed up so that when the COVID came, and we were not sure actually how virulent, how pathogenic the virus was, we adopted a posture that was a balance between what we have for EVD and monkeypox. The reason I'm sharing this with you is because the idea of the current capabilities that we have and the ability to move from the current capabilities to respond to new contingencies is something that going ahead, all businesses and all stakeholders, including the premises owners, have to have as a mindset. The ability to be agile, the ability to know what the technology capabilities are out there, and the ability to work quickly with our partners to be able to respond to those contingencies. So that's my quick take on the question for now, and there are other things I can share later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ming Fai. I think, that is very well said, right? Prevention is always better than cure. I think we all know that. And, besides battling the current, it's good to know as well that, we are actually better placed for future pandemics as well. Okay, so how about Prof. Teo? What is the impact of COVID-19 on the concept of clean and cleaning? And will this actually evolve given the situation locally and in the region? Maybe can you share your thoughts on that?
Thanks very much, Gloria. So maybe I could start off by mentioning that I expect the aspirations towards cleaning and clean hygiene actually will not change that much. It wouldn't evolve that much, but rather what would change is actually in the implementation, in the protocols, actually like what Ming Fai mentioned. Because let's start off by looking at the region first. And the region, I would refer to the Southeast Asian region around Singapore. The reality is that the definition of clean and cleaning actually varies significantly, whether you're looking at a country like Singapore or whether you're looking at countries where the state of development may not be as advanced as Singapore. So if you remember in the early days, Singaporeans were quibbling over access to hand sanitizers. And I would come back and talk about the WASH program, which is the Washing, Sanitation and Hygiene program that the United Nations, WHO, championed. The WASH program actually has very basic standards for developing countries, for any countries. But in a country like Singapore, actually we weren't talking about WASH program because our attainment of WASH program is already extremely high, thanks to colleagues at NEA. But if we now look at some of our Southeast Asian countries, the definition, the perception, and the attainment of standards in clean and cleaning would be very varied when we benchmark against different countries. So when we start to think about will the concepts of clean or cleaning change because of COVID-19, I would actually say that if we are able to achieve the basics that are laid out very nicely according to the WASH program, countries would have already attained a significant level of development that will provide them with certain resilience against infectious diseases. Many of it would be waterborne infections. And then we start to think about, are this sufficient against a respiratory pathogen such as COVID-19 or such as influenza, such as SARS? And so that's the first point. The second point is actually the region continues to be a hotbed for emerging infectious diseases to happen. And there's avian influenza, there are resistance against quite a lot of infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, HIV, malaria. Actually, a lot of the drug resistance happen in this part of the world before it spreads to whether it is Africa or Latin America. Actually, Southeast Asia remains a hotbed for drug resistance to emerge. And because of that, the question now comes back, is it fundamentally about the concept of clean and cleaning? It certainly plays a role, but again, from the policy angle, I actually would say all 10 countries in Southeast Asia have the right policy around the aspiration towards clean and cleaning. But what is difficult is actually on ground implementation. We have seen this happen even locally in Singapore, and this is where I will draw a very quick reference to the situation in our migrant worker dormitories. Actually, in our migrant worker dormitories, we have very strict standards, but why did we see that outbreak happen in April last year? It escalated very quickly to thousands of cases in a day. But it is all down to whether the protocols were sufficiently and adequately rolled out. And I think that's one of the key points that I will mention. But I thought it's also useful to highlight that when we think about the concept of clean and cleaning, earlier on, Gloria, you asked that poll, or our host asked that poll about whose responsibility is it. And I think I will broadly classify it into three groups. There's the behavioral, the personal responsibility, there's the institutional, the community responsibility, as well as the policies. The policies are there to guide, but at the end of the day, it is the implementation that is carried out, the infrastructure, the institutions, and also personal behavior. And so I would just end off by saying that we are not thinking about huge, big changes or evolution in concepts of clean and cleaning, but let's come back to the basics, especially when we think about the region, Southeast Asia region, that are we able to achieve the basics in terms of the WASH program? And I think that would already be very important.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Teo. I think, just changing in terms of the mindsets and the behavior, I think that itself, the fundamental change is probably even harder than, the changes that we can do to policies and, legislations and stuff. So, thank you for that. And the cleaning industry has actually been at the front line of the fight to keep the public safe from COVID-19. So I would like to check with Tony, Laurent, and Joseph as well, that as a business insider, how has COVID-19 impacted the cleaning industry in terms of industry challenges, as well as opportunities in the provision of public hygiene, municipal sanitation, and disinfection services? Maybe we can start with Tony first, and before we move on to Laurent and Joseph.
Thank you, Gloria. Well, personally, I am glad to see that the cleaning industry is acknowledged to be at the front line of the fight against COVID. Thank you very much. Right, the environmental services sector, more specifically the cleaning industry, has always suffered from manpower shortages, and COVID-19 exacerbated the problem. A segment of the workforce, especially the elderly, stayed away from work and some foreign workers returned their home countries, and travel restrictions curtailed the supply of new foreign workers. As the market recovered, we saw that there was increased service demand due to increased cleaning frequencies and increased need for sanitizing services, for example. And other recovering industries also competed for the same limited pool of manpower, and this has resulted in a manpower crunch for the industry. Secondly, we felt that there were gaps in the pandemic response in terms of the knowledge and the skill set. The industry has largely forgotten the lessons that we have learned from SARS 17 years ago. The cleaning workforce did not retain enough knowledge and know-how on how to protect themselves and the community, as well as not knowing how to do disinfection. Thirdly, I will touch on the fact that prior to COVID-19, the cleaning industry did not deploy enough technology in its work. So technology in the sense of mechanization, automation, digitalization. And the technology was not able to play a greater role in helping to relieve manpower shortages and possibly lowering the exposure risk to the virus. Now, we felt that there were opportunities. The realization and the lessons that we learned from COVID-19 has pushed the industry to accelerate their transformation. We must learn how to wean ourselves from over-dependence on foreign workers, but instead, perhaps strengthen the Singapore core workforce. Secondly, I think there is an impetus to embark on projects to upgrade the skills and redesign the jobs for the workforce, ultimately transforming the workforce from one that is low-skilled, low-wage, to one that is multi-skilled and probably decently paid. Companies will be spurred to adopt more technology to assist in the manpower shortages. And lastly, perhaps there is an added momentum for service buyers and service providers alike to embark on the outcome-based contract model. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So how about maybe we can get Lauren to share?
Much, Gloria, and thank you for the rest of the panelists as well for what you've been sharing today. When we start talking about the last year and a half, what we can see is that there has been a lot of challenge, there's been a lot of opportunity, and there's been a lot of change. And what it has really done is highlight that cleaning is an essential frontline service in combating COVID-19, as well as other potential viruses. The industry has played an important role in keeping the community safe, as well as the continuous support in the safe return of the society to a more routine normal. Our industry has had to be nimble, and today, cleaning and disinfection professionals are working in a bit of a new environment. There have been continual disruptions to business, new government regulations and guidelines that the cleaning industry, like other industries, has had to work within. So in Australia, we have seen situations where we have had no international travel that's been taking place. We have had states that have been in lockdowns, and within those states, we've even had regions that have been classified as hotspots. And that's especially something that we've been going through at the moment, as we've had the resurge with the Delta virus within our states of New South Wales and Victoria. We've also had to manage the concerns of customers as well as government decision makers. So we've had to work with customers and facilities in providing education and support to them to help them to understand what they could do in a situation that in some cases they may not have been so familiar with. And this has been while they've also been having to handle continual disruptions to business. There has been a tremendous amount of information, news and questions around COVID-19, and a challenge has been that it's not always been accurate and helpful. And that has meant that it's made it particularly difficult for our cleaning contractors for the fact that they're not only having to deal with the fact that they're having to handle different scenarios and work with some of those facilities, but they're also having to manage some of this information and guide them through it as well. It's been incredibly important more than ever for facility managers and our contract cleaners to have a close, mutually beneficial partnership to support each other through these unprecedented times. And this has been probably what we've started to see in Australia, where there's been a significant opportunity, especially when it comes to engagement and revisiting scopes of work, which have been incredibly important to do during this pandemic. By now, we've realised that the reality is each facility has its own specific needs, from heightened cleaning frequencies to added routine disinfecting or the need to address a contaminated area. And by now, we should have had better understanding of how COVID-19 spreads. So looking at it from the person-to-person perspective, the role of airborne transmission, but also contact with contaminated surfaces, which is probably the more important element to be addressing right about now when we're starting to talk about the cleaning aspects. We have known for years that bacteria and viruses can survive outside of the body for days, months even, in the right conditions on surfaces. SARS-CoV-2 virus can remain on the back of things like surgical masks for 7 days, glass for 4 days, stainless steel for 2 to 3 days, wood for 2 days, and they're just some of the surfaces that I'm just mentioning out of many. And that's information also came from last year from the New England Journal of Medicine. So we know there's a possibility that the virus can cause infection by remaining viable on surfaces. As a result, it's been incredibly important that our industry advocate for responsible and reasonable disinfection methods that can reduce cross-contamination. It is incredibly important to identify hazards and form a risk assessment to identify areas that are most likely to play a role in transmitting a virus. We've seen in some situations around the world, lots of big companies, as well as cleaning providers, who have been putting together floor plans or maps to show where high touch point surfaces or high touch points and enhanced cleaning surfaces are. They usually color code them to make it easier to be identifying. When we start looking at the market and we start going out into the market itself, we've also had facilities that in some situations have also been having their cleaning staff, some that do the regular elements of cleaning, that would be using like one particular vest, and then they'd have their high touch point team that would be in a different coloured vest. But last year, when we've been in a situation in Australia where last year we did go into a bit of a lockdown, but we pretty much came out of it and entered into a normal phase. However, we have had the surge again now later on with the Delta variant. But when we were coming out of it, we started to see more of that visual aspect of cleaners during the day on the floor being able to handle these high touch points. And it's been an opportunity, there has been an opportunity for the market to be able to engage with facilities, with government, with business owners on how to manage these situations that are of such relevance and importance. And I think a really important element to address here, and it's been covered by the earlier panelists to a degree as well, is the fact that there is a reality, and that is that there is more to cleaning than just a pandemic. And I think that's really important when we start talking about the transmission of viruses and bacteria on surfaces and why we need to be looking at these high touch points. I mean, we can look at a bit of an example here in Australia when we start comparing last year's cold and flu season. So COVID-19 was taking place. However, we'd actually started by our cold and flu season to come out of the pandemic and start to go back into a bit of a normal state of life. And the World Health Organization reported that Australia, New Zealand and surrounding areas, that less than 0.1% of those that were tested for flu actually proved positive, and normally that would be around 5 to 10%. So this kind of does show that putting the right measures in place, such as cleaning and disinfecting, does make a difference, and that this can remain low going forward if people continue to invest in proper cleaning. And that's what we really do want to highlight, is investing in proper cleaning. The COVID-19 pandemic has increased awareness of how germs can survive in the environment on surfaces. It has also highlighted the need to read the disinfectant product label and pay attention to safety data sheets, as well as the dwell or wet contact time of disinfectants on surfaces. There is an important need to ensure that facilities, as well as our contract cleaners, utilise the experience and expertise and knowledge of our distributors, our suppliers and our manufacturers. We also have to be looking to follow the guidelines and ensuring that the right product is being used in the right situation, And that is also, there is training that is also involved in being able to handle those products. And I will emphasize that training aspect. These are discussion points that leading cleaning manufacturers have been communicating, but it has been the pandemic that has highlighted this element and the need for it. And with ISSA, we have a division called GBAC, which is the Global Biorisk Advisory Council. And with a lot of the information that we've been putting out, we always refer back to the fact that people need to liaise with their manufacturers, suppliers, and distributors. They need to be paying attention to manufacturer guidelines. It also goes back to my earlier conversation about how important it is and why there's been such an opportunity about engagement and revisiting scopes of works. There should be this engaged interaction that we start to see about why certain products are being used, how are they being used, what training has been provided to actually manage those products. In the United States, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, has published a resource entitled The Core Components of Environmental Cleaning and Disinfection, and it focuses on cleaning and disinfection of non-critical surfaces in hospitals, and therefore is kind of applicable to be able to use this on any surface in any facility. Now, the CDC focuses on 6 core components to help reduce the risk of spreading germs and infection from touching surfaces. Now, to be honest with you, these may not be relatively new to our market from the cleaning industry's perspective on understanding, but what the Global Biorisk Advisory Council have stated, and that's GBAC via ISSA, is that what it does do is identify, what is new about it is that it's been packaged into one document of 6 core concepts. So it's kind of like the industry is getting behind what the broader market, is getting behind the industry on what we have been saying for quite a significant amount of time. Now, what COVID-19 has done is provide a greater appreciation and value for cleaning, disinfection, and hygiene. However, as we enter a new phase of stabilisation, to a certain degree there, one of the biggest challenges is maintaining the learnings from this experience. And I think this goes back to what the panel was earlier stating about how even with past experiences, have we taken the learnings from that and continued it along? When we come to being able to look at these particular aspects, what we have to be able to understand is that we need to incorporate what will happen from this point on when it comes to the price point elements. So as pandemic fatigue starts to set in, as more price pressures and as more approach, where will this actually lead? Now, historically, in Australia, and I think there's been a bit of a trend in other countries, there's been a view to see cleaning as a cost. The reality, as has been demonstrated through this pandemic, is that demonstrated proper cleaning and hygiene practices are an investment in human health, and they can aid in keeping occupants, employees, and the general public safe. Investments in quality cleaning programs and practices have also led to reduced operation costs through occupant wellness as well as productivity. It's led to asset preservation as well as sustainability. It's also resulted in social returns that have also resulted in which have increased the cleaning company's image as well as customer satisfaction. For ISSA, what we've done is we've also supported our value of clean products with being able to communicate this out to our market and our report, our value of clean report, which has been vital to our market and being able to understand the greater aspects when it comes to cleaning, not just the cleaning for the pandemic, but how we start engaging further down the line conversations. The reality is that there's a lot more to cleaning, and with various countries in different phases and states of stabilisation or recovery, industry stakeholders will continue to need to ensure that they are adhering to strict regulations and guidelines, while at the same time addressing the legitimate concerns of employees, occupants, customers and contractors. What we've started to see is that we have a public, especially over here in Australia and New Zealand, we have a public and community that is far more conscious and aware of hygiene and cleaning than ever. And quite often, they will make their decisions based on their opinions. In fact, in a recent survey, the evolution of hygiene preferences post-COVID-19, which was done by SD, and that was done actually this year, it identified that 61% of those surveyed have higher standards on hygiene products used. Also, that about 67% of those surveyed said they would tell others about a poor hygiene experience in a public place. So apart from the need to keep the public safe, there's also the additional pressure of these legitimate expectations that we're starting to see in the market. And this has also resulted in changes in the way that cleaning is also being done, the need to be visual, to be able to provide the market with security and that sense of security as they're actually starting to open up and facilities are starting to open up. So there's a much more broader presence of signage, information, ways of being able to communicate what is being done by either a contract cleaner or by a facility. I mean, from our perspective at ISSA, we have the Global Biorisk Advisory Council that have developed GBAC STAR programs, which looks at facility and BSC accreditation. And what that's done is we've started to see a lot of them being able to publicise that quite heavily. And the reason being is because that's that need to create a professionalisation, but also as a need to be able to convey to the community and the general public what they are actually doing to be able to transfer that information. So what we're seeing is a lot of change, but as some of the earlier panelists said as well, this has been a value of clean that we've been needing and been trying to convey for quite a significant period of time. And what hopefully this has done is highlight the significant aspects to the value that cleaning offers. And what we need to be focusing on is how we're going to keep that momentum moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. And I think, the need for the awareness, I think Tony mentioned earlier that, there is this outcome-based contracts that, we are actually focusing on right now, which is an opportunity. I think that actually ties in quite nicely to what Lauren was actually mentioning about, the need for the awareness for good cleaning, as well as, the need for investment to make that happen. So I think that's a good point raised there. So maybe can I get Joseph to also share your thoughts on this as well?
First of all, Gloria, thank you for inviting ISS and to the summit and also for this panel session. Because, in fact, the previous panelists have mentioned a lot, in fact, so I apologize if I need to, if I repeat some of it. So I'll start off in a way from a high level and then talk a little more about how it's impacted us as a company. So in overall, really, global health crises such as we're incurring right now requires organized leadership and structures. And governments, along with industry, need to create this, need to coordinate a joint pandemic preparedness framework. So we, governments, pharma, universities, other stakeholders like ISS, have the ability to focus on our respective strengths. And that's really, really important because we all have a very important role to play. We all have a piece of the puzzle that we can all contribute to in terms of preparing for pandemics, also reacting to pandemics. The next viral outbreak probably cannot be prevented, but we can prevent the next pandemic with better preparation. That's, I think, a very, very important aspect that we need to prepare to prevent the next outbreak. There's no doubt that there's a need for partnership between public and private stakeholders for this to happen, to make sure it's successful. I think it was mentioned before too, by the other panelists, we should be much better prepared for COVID-19 because the virus that causes it is very closely related to the other coronaviruses, particularly SARS in 2003, and Tony mentioned that in his speech. As we all know, there are more than 500,000 animal viruses that can impact humans. We've only experienced a very minor proportion of that. So we just need to understand that this is not going to disappear. This is not one-off. In fact, it's occurring more often now than in previous situations.
Thank you, Joseph. Sorry, just to interrupt you a little. We seem to have a bit of audio technicalities with your side, so maybe we could check on it. Meanwhile, I'm heading it back to Gloria to continue while we sort out the audio side for your end.
Okay, thank you, Sir Charlene. So we'll come back to you, Joseph, on that. And maybe just moving on, the evolving COVID-19 situation that we have worldwide actually meant that policymakers and industry players have to be nimble and plan ahead. So in our panelists' view, what are the critical success factors to build a systemic preparedness and resilience to support cleaner and healthier cities? And what should the government, industry, and the academia do to get ahead of the curve? Perhaps I can start with you first, Prof. Teo.
Thanks, Gloria. So perhaps I'll just mention the three aspects that I feel are critical. The first is definitely the infrastructure, because there are, when it comes to respiratory pathogens, we are always thinking about air exchange, air filters. When it comes to bacteria and viruses, we're thinking about surface infections. So UV filters, flushing toilets. For example, with Singapore Airlines, we're talking about how just a simple adaptation of covering the airplane seat toilets before flushing will already dramatically reduce the risk of spreading COVID-19. So some of these practices are infrastructural in nature. So that's definitely one element that, in my opinion, is quite critical. The second is what I think all five panelists have actually touched on, which are the protocols and the capacity. Because the protocols, as well as the people who are trained, are they properly trained to protect themselves? Are they properly trained to use the cleaning agents in the right way to protect the users, the environment? The protocols and the capacity building are aspects that we cannot overlook. And finally, in line with the vote that we did in the beginning, that everyone is actually responsible for cleaner and healthier cities. This comes back to that cultural, the behavioral part, because when we look at resilience against future infectious diseases, we think about simple things like mask wearing, personal hygiene, respiratory etiquette, whether people are covering their mouth and nose in the right manner when they're coughing and sneezing. This tend to be cultural, behavioral, and individual in nature. So I think these are the three areas that we need to look at if we are thinking about critical success factors. But I'm also happy to hear from some of my other panelist members as well.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Teo. I think I'll just go back to Joseph. I think earlier on you also mentioned about the training of the employees as well as, ensuring that they are actually educated about COVID. I think that goes back to Prof. Teo's point. So would you like to elaborate a bit more about that?
Sure, Gloria. Sorry I got cut off, and hopefully you can hear me better now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry. In fact, what I was also just mentioning before, I said, one of the things we need to do is also we should have been better prepared for COVID because of the coronaviruses. As Tony mentioned, we could have learned from SARS, right? And the key thing what we can do right now after the COVID-19 response is to build on this foundation and to make sure that we collaborate, governments, pharma sector, universities, industries such as us, to make sure that we have we have a structure in place with the goal of establishing a unified defense globally against these future outbreaks. We, as a company, we are leading the workplace experience and facility management company, so where cleaning is core. The pandemic has raised the importance of the cleaning industry, as Lauren has mentioned. It's so important that when people come to work, you feel safe to work in. So it has really disrupted, the pandemic has disrupted the relationship between people and places.
Sorry, Joseph, I got to probably stop you there again. Sorry, it's getting a little bit choppy on your end. So.
Sorry.
Yes, maybe perhaps we could ask you to check on your landline while we will continue with the rest of the panelists.
Okay.
But maybe, Gloria, maybe I could just add on what Joseph had mentioned, because I think he touched on a very important point, which is earlier on we talked about the lessons that we learned from SARS, and Tony made a very strong pitch for that. I think if we look at what happened in Singapore's context, SARS happened and hit us in a big way in 2003, but it affected us mainly in the hospitals. And if you look at Singapore's hospital response since the beginning of COVID-19, actually our hospitals managed extremely well in terms of whether there were hospital infections happening or whether there were protocols that were breached in the hospitals. Actually, before this last month, Singapore's hospitals were extremely resilient against COVID-19. So those were the lessons that I felt we learned very well, and we remembered them very well, and they have been embedded in our hospital protocols, whether it is the way we train our nurses, our healthcare workers, our receptionists, or the cleaning protocols that we adopt in hospital. So I think the vision right now, collectively, that we hope moving forward is that Singapore and other countries will learn the lessons from COVID-19 and extend that to the community as well, because we learned from SARS how to protect the hospitals. Now we hope we learn from COVID how to protect the rest of the community, including the households. Over back to Gloria.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Prof. And perhaps, Lauren, would you like to share as well, what are these critical success factors?
Joseph was making some really good points there that just before he had to just go on pause for a bit. And I think one of the key points he was mentioning was about how we do need to have need going forward to involve all key stakeholders. So we need to understand the capability of how products can work with manufacturer devices. We need to be looking at dwell and wet contact times. We need to be also looking at manufacturer guidelines and instructions. But also there was an important point that Joseph was mentioning, that was in relation to training, and some of the other panelists were talking about. Sorry. Swear to God, don't have COVID. But at the same time, what we started to see was that we needed to be able to invest in training. And this is in training internally, and also training when we're liaising with facilities. And it's important for facilities to be engaging with BSCs to understand if their staff have the relative knowledge to be able to utilise certain products, as well as understanding what's actually taking place with COVID-19 and having some basic fundamental knowledge of that. Sorry. Sorry. But what we've also seen is that there is a need for to be considering the fact that the cleaning is more than a pandemic. So government officials, the industry, also need to be taking this forward. And we need to be, sorry, something came in my throat. We need to be taking this forward and being able to understand that there's more to a pandemic. And we need to be able to say, okay, what we've learned from this, we can transfer into our general clean and how we handle things. Like we've spoken before, there is other viruses, other bacteria. The reality is we have norovirus outbreaks that take place. And it's being able to handle those situations moving forward. And some of the skill sets that we've learnt in these particular situations can carry across into those particular areas. And I spoke about some of those points before. In some instances, we look at that and maybe there's that theory around, okay, well, how's that going to be from a cost perspective? In some instances, it's not necessarily about doing more. It's about cleaning smarter and not necessarily harder. So about looking at that scope of work, so identifying the key priorities and starting to develop around those. So I think that's a particular area of point. And there needs to be that interaction that's taking place. I think that throughout this year plus, we've seen a lot of surveys that have been developed by the market. And I think we need to, as an industry and as a wider community, take into consideration what has been developed. Because what it does do is kind of gives that idea about where the public is at the moment, what they're wanting, where their concerns are, and a bit of a direction about where certain areas are going to go when it comes to certain industry trends as well. So I think we need to be focusing on those particular areas. I think there needs to be this focus on stakeholders coming together. We need to learn from what we've experienced through this time, and we need to be taking it, moving it forward. I think government also needs to be getting involved with industry and liaising with industry. And speaking from an association, I'll say from an association perspective as well, we do represent the industry in itself, and we do have advisory councils that represent various segments. So it needs to be that whole integration that takes place moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Thank you. So I think, what we're hearing is that, there needs to be investment in training, we need stakeholders to actually, we'll come back to that point about stakeholders coming together to work on this. But in terms of policy making, right, Ming Fai, do you have anything to share on that point?
Yeah, actually I was thinking about the critical success factors that you mentioned earlier and our responses to that. To be able to actually get a good grip on what the success factors are, I think first we have to understand what are the critical challenges that we are facing, and this is important. I'll name three. In Singapore, the COVID-19 guidelines on disinfection were promulgated last year, and I think it's filtered its way down to many of the stakeholders here. And this is actually quite related to what Lauren has mentioned in terms of what to clean, how to clean. When our inspectors go down for disinfection checks, audits, what is required. And because it's audited, I think the interest is there to understand what the technical requirements are. What does it actually mean? You know, things like contact time, the spread of disease, disinfection, how do you clean, things that Lauren had mentioned earlier. So that's the first critical challenge, right? COVID-19 measures will be with us for quite a while. But on top of that, the second challenge that the industry faces, and actually this predates COVID-19, is really the cost challenges. I think Tony mentioned it earlier, related to manpower tightness as well. I think it's been mentioned, the average age of cleaners in Singapore is about 60 years old. Not so easy to get people to join the profession. And earlier this year, we've also announced that the progressive wage model will kick in from 2023 for wages of cleaners. General cleaners will go, the wages of general cleaners will go up by between 16 to 20% in 2023. That is done in part actually to make the industry more attractive, to get more people to join, and give them a career path, a training pathway as well, because related to the increase in salaries is also the requirement for there to be more training, right? Which is actually the third critical challenge that the industry faces, capabilities. Today, you see that the role of the cleaning company has gone beyond just cleaning, physical wipe downs, etc. Very often they are asked to do disinfection. Very often they are also asked about technology. How do I, as a premises owner, do my cleaning in my premises more effectively, more efficiently, without relying on just labor, right? And this is where I think the outcome-based contracting model that was earlier mentioned comes in. So as an agency, I think we want to facilitate that, to be able to push out this concept that the industry needs to work together with the business owners, because the challenges are actually common to all the stakeholders. COVID-19 has taught us what it means to clean and clean properly, and we have heard from Lauren that it does help, it is effective in preventing illness. Cost pressures will be there. It is expected to grow because between 2023 to 2028, the government has already announced a schedule of wage increases. Now, admittedly, wage is not the significant part of a company's cost, but nevertheless, I think it behooves us to be able to I guess, train up the cleaners, equip them with greater capability so that even as the pay is increased, the ability to do more is also there. And besides the existing pool of cleaners that we have, environmental sanitation workers that we have, how the job can then look like at the end of these 5-6 years. Is it just a matter of cleaning, wiping, or are you looking at workers that are able to understand and articulate what it means to disinfect, what it means to have effective cleaning, productive cleaning, where you don't necessarily have to have, X persons available in the premises. So coming back, I think the critical success factor goes back to what are the critical challenges that we face, and being able to answer that with a clear eye, I think will stand the industry and all of us in good state. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ming, for points taken. So I'm just conscious of the time because I see questions coming through. So I'll just go on to another last point, but maybe I could get Tony to just share, in terms of your perspectives from a cleaning industry, how should the public, private, and people sectors partnership evolve in support of a more prepared and resilient ecosystem in the new normal? So could you share some inputs on that?
Well, we feel that it is clear that public health is correlated to personal hygiene. And upholding high cleanliness and hygiene standards is the first defense against any disease transmission. And so in that sense, we feel that it is important that the masses, the man in the street, knows all about taking personal responsibility for the cleanliness of their surroundings, and they can directly contribute to a cleaner, healthier, and more resilient Singapore. So it would be wonderful if an all-of-nation effort can be brought to bear in this period now to bring forth and normalize a new standard of social norm and behavior in Singapore and sustain this past COVID-19. Right? So how does it help us without having the need to pick up after everybody, clean up messy washrooms and return food trays? I think the cleaning industry can enjoy, I'm not sure whether enjoy is the right word, but enjoy reduced service demand. So with a reduced service demand, we can then migrate to a less manpower intensive workforce, but a higher skilled workforce, and focus on the deep cleaning, the sanitizing, and cleaning up environmental contamination, not cleaning up after people. Right? So I hope all this would contribute to a more resilient Singapore.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. I think that comes back to the point where we had earlier on Slido, right? Everybody actually plays a part, and we should actually be cleaning up after ourselves and not after other people. So,
can I add something to that? Can I add something? So, Gloria, just to add to Tony's thing, I think as people have mentioned previously, training, in terms of the cleaning profession has changed, right? So it's not only training them in terms of how to do the cleaning or disinfection, it's also having them to understand why, especially on COVID, what are the symptoms for COVID? Why are they doing something? Why are they doing high-touch surface clear disinfections more often? So it's that. But I think the cleaning professionals are moving in a different direction too, where they're also helping in terms of nudging, changing behaviors for the end user. So they're becoming much more than just labor, so-called labor intensive. It's also making sure that people keep the same behaviors that we've learned during COVID. We're very good as human beings of forgetting what we've just experienced. A year from now, we will probably go back to, unfortunately, to the behaviors we had pre-COVID. We should have learned from SARS in 2003. We should have maintained those behaviors in the last 17, 18 years. So for us as a company, as one of the largest cleaning companies in the world, our cleaning professionals will become much more active in terms of also being change agents at the customer sites.
Yep. Okay, thanks Joseph for that. And how about Prof. Teo, what can the role that academic can play in this, and what are the partnership opportunities that are available?
So thanks again. Thanks, Gloria. So from an academic standpoint, there's always been 3 areas that academics like myself and my colleagues have been very active in. The first is really looking at the evidence space around what are the practices that are actually effective. And then once we know what is effective, we can advocate for the right policies and programs to be rolled out. And I will again use a specific example, disinfecting tunnels. There were countries that were inventing and innovating disinfecting tunnels at the beginning of COVID-19 outbreak. And actually from the science perspective, they really didn't work at all. And I think this is where there will be a lot of inventions that scientists will come up with, but there is a need to evaluate whether those are effective before we roll out in a nationwide, or to scale it up nationally. So that touches on the second point, which is the role of academics, on the role of really monitoring and evaluating some of these products and programs that are being rolled out. When we say that mask wearing is effective, are we enforcing this appropriately, and is it effective? So not just on generating the evidence, but secondly on evaluating whether the programs, the policies that we have in place are effective, and more importantly, cost effective. Because if we start to think about COVID-19 being an endemic disease, are we going to implement and impose some of our current restrictions and measures for the long term? There will be a cost to it, and would it be cost efficient? The third is really in the area of communications, because I think I like to think that academia remains independent from policymakers, so we are not affected by politicians nor swayed by policymakers. So we are supposed to be independent as a form of communicator to really touch on whether policies are to explain some of the rationale behind the policies. So I see this is where the role of academic can play.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Teo. So maybe just in the essence of time, I'll just move on to the questions. But before I'll do that, I'd just like to check with Joseph. What are some of the emerging innovations, solutions and business models that policymakers and business leaders should actually pay attention to, and to pivot business operations for agility and competitive advantage?
Yes, that's an excellent question, Gloria. So, it's one thing what we're continuously trying to do right now is to use technology to improve our service offering. And even during the pandemic, what we introduced was a product called Ecosperity to provide the reassurance to the end user. We're always looking at the end user as the core of whatever we deliver. And technology will play a major role at that. And right now, what we're using is something that you will probably know for adenosine triphosphate technology to show the effectiveness of our cleaning, of our disinfection, to provide that, science-based evidence to the end user that where they're working, the places they're working in are safe. We're also testing new technologies like, UVC robots. We're testing products that can protect surfaces for extended periods of time. So, 24 hours or 48 hours. So these are things that we just need to keep on working on and to test to make sure that they actually provide the outcomes that we want going forward. So as from the industry point of view, this again needs to work in the big sphere. It needs to work with the framework I mentioned originally, along with governments, along with other partners, along with academia, that we all work in a common alignment so that we all play our role, all play our respective expertise to contribute this going forward.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. So I think I've got a question here in terms of, what are the speakers' view on building resilience with fewer and older workforce, and the tipping point where we set our foot down to give a required resources to public health sector sufficient to handle the next pandemic situation. How I'm reading this is that, how do we actually expect the industry to cope with the rising demand without adequate foreign workforce? So, because Minfai, just now you mentioned that, the cleaners in Singapore right now, the average age that we have is about 60 years old. So how are we expecting the industry to cope with this without the use of the foreign workforce?
Yeah. Firstly, hello. Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Firstly, let me just thank the person who raised this question, because I think it is indeed a very pertinent question that reflects the pressures that the industry is currently facing, especially now. I think we are well aware, right? Last year, where there was severe disruptions to the manpower, and then at the same time, the requirements kept coming in from the clients, asking the industry to step up cleaning. And at the same time, the SMM measures were put in place that restricts cross-deployment of workforce, perhaps not having the more elderly cleaners work in certain types of premises, really for their own protection. But when the pressure points come together, I can imagine just the kind of stress that the industry faces. Which is why I think it behooves us, like I said, to go back to the 3 critical challenges that I mentioned earlier. These are challenges that won't go away, and they are here to stay. The issue with foreign manpower, as we know, is that, even before COVID, there was a social consensus on what should be the right number. With COVID, it has shown that actually foreign manpower is also very prone to disruption in a pandemic situation such as this. Therefore, I think the answer lies in, firstly, the business model. How do businesses really want to, on the buyer side, this is not just a cleaning side problem, right? On the buyer side, costs will go up. How are you going to restructure your business model such that you can keep the costs contained. Our suggestion, what we view is outcome-based contracting, right? Because you are not going to be able to get the same number of workers. We hope that with the pay increases, with some of the job redesign and restructuring that comes in play, depend less on the workforce numbers per se, right? So we hope that will happen. But on the buyer side as well, you really have to start thinking about what is it that you want to be able to set as performance indicators, so that you allow the opportunity for the service provider to innovate, to be able to kind of service your needs, perhaps with lesser manpower. And I hope then with that, on the service side, the business model also has to evolve, presumably, because the need for more technology will be there, right? Today it's very hard to invest because, if the buyer is only asking for headcount, really, there is no incentive. But where the buyer is now asking for things like technology, where they're asking for things like increased capabilities, right? Where, built into the contract contingencies, where if I need to step up, we have an agreed schedule of rates, provide me with response time over weekends to do some sort of emergency cleaning is fairer for both sides. When I bid for the contract, I can bid a more reasonable price as opposed to now where it's a bit harder because you expect a certain number of people to turn up every day of the week. So really, there isn't a silver bullet solution. I don't think it's a matter of just allowing more foreign workers to come in. I really think that sessions like this are very important where stakeholders are able to gather, discuss the challenges, and then work on what are the possible solutions that in concert, right? So on the regulatory side, we will set certain standards. We are also, on our part, increasing our capabilities, trying to understand how disinfection works better, give out better guidelines on, say, UV equipment, right? There's a greater interest now in UV germicidal technologies. So we will give out greater guidelines so that industries can then better position themselves for how to then market these technologies to business premises that might need such technologies. So really, that's my response to the question raised. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you, Ming Fai. Anything to add, Tony, from your end?
Well, I would like to say that this is still very much a work in progress. We certainly need a certain proportion of the workforce to be foreign in order to carry out the heavy lifting, do all the work that the local workforce do not want to do. But I guess we need to buy time to build the capability of the local workforce through the programs that Ming Fai mentioned just now about PWM, about the training, about building, rebranding the industry to attract younger workers. So I think both has to be in place for the system to work and for the ecosystem to carry forward to the future.
Yeah. Yes, Prof.
Maybe I could turn the question around and ask Lauren for her experience, because this reliance on older workforce seems to be a practice that it's very common in countries like Singapore and Japan. But what does Australia actually do when it comes to the cleaning workforce? Do you outsource it to foreign workers from different countries, or actually you have an in-house local team of workers in Australia that is executing this job? And how do you actually provide the necessary training and remuneration to encourage Australians to take up the job?
This has been a really important point in Australia. So one of the things that we have had to deal with is we've had a lot of regulations that have come in for making sure that pay is being met and that requirements are there for the system for our local requirements and for our employees, for being able to ensure that nothing is happening from a subcontractor perspective. So we have had a lot of legislations and rules that have come through Australia, especially over the last, I'd say, 18 months to 2 years. So that's another thing that we've had to deal with within our market. It's not just been pandemic, it's been pandemic in conjunction to other things that were already taking place, new regulations, new rules in other areas of business that we also had to adjust to at the same time and make sure we're being adhered to. From our particular market here, we do have mix. We have various in-house cleaning services. We also have building service contractors who are our contract cleaners. So from education and training, that can stem from a couple of different elements. We have elements where there are government required like to pay for qualifications in which people can be obtaining cleaning certifications. We also have training that places like ISSA also are able to facilitate in. What we've started to also see, especially throughout this pandemic as an association, is we've also started to see that mid-management has wanted to be developing and focusing on their skill sets throughout this time period as well. So we've seen a lot of our courses that deal with the development of mid-management to senior management also being taken up. And that's also being looking at breaking out into, I think we spoke about earlier, how auditing has become really important in being able to verify what's actually being done. And so our accredited ordering professionals course has actually been really popular. So we have a market at the moment where there's in-house training. We've got external training taking place. But I think that what we're starting to see in our market as well is the desire for more professionalisation when it does come to the cleaning industry. When we look at the pandemic that we've been through at the moment and the skill set and the vital role that it has played as well, there's a respect that should come to that as well. I mean, for what actually is being done and by what is being done by our frontline workers. So in our market over here at the moment, we do have those particular elements. I mean, we don't necessarily have to look at an older age group. We've got quite a mixed age group when it comes to our cleaning profession. We do have an element over here in Australia where we look at there is an element that we're trying to tackle at the moment when it comes to subcontracting. Now, don't get me wrong, some subcontracting elements can work well if done efficiently. There are some other elements that we're having to be looking at and investigating over here in Australia. So we do have, when it comes to cleaners, we do tend to see a lot more of students and stuff that have been involved coming through the contract cleaning side of things. So it is a real mix when it comes to our industry in Australia. We do have a lot of local trained professionals. We have some people from overseas that might be students that are over here that work in the cleaning profession as well. So there is a mix to it, but we do have a lot of regulations and a lot of protocols, especially over the last 2 years, that have come into place to govern our industry.
Can I answer something also, Tony, on that? We have a company around 400,000 employees and 250,000 are cleaning professionals. We also are challenged in terms of the workforce, but the key element here is that we are really in Europe, especially where most of our businesses is very much based on outcome-based services. So this also helps. If you look at the number of employees we have, as I just mentioned, if I look like a country in Denmark, where 40% of our cleaning staff will be new Danes entering the country, new migrants entering the country. What the cleaning profession on the positive side does, it also gives people their first job in society when they're entering a country, so they assimilate into society, provide them that social mobility. And this is something we're very proud of in getting people integrated into societies they enter from if they come from another country. But the key element here is that we've moved away from input-based into output-based, and that's where we also need to educate customers, governments, is that outcome-based is the way to go. Don't look at, I can supply you 10 cleaners. Say, what is the service levels that you want to achieve at the end of the day?
And I think, Joseph, that you raise a really valid point there as well. And that is a really important element going forward. And that is back to that element that we've kept on discussing throughout this entire panel. And that is the need to have that engagement, to understand what are the requirements when it comes to a facility themselves, and to be able to help develop those requirements, to also be able to provide a form of a solution. So BS what we need to be doing is being in the solutions model of how we actually go to our customers and start actually actively involving what their needs are, what their necessities are, and also being able to have a bit of a solutions model going forward with them.
Okay, thank you, Laurent and Joseph. I think, I'll just, looking at the time, I will just take one more question. And I think that's also a question I wanted to come back to earlier with what Prof. Teo have actually mentioned. How can public education in young children and adults play a bigger role in future pandemics? So, I think, Prof. Teo, earlier you mentioned about, this all goes back into behavioral changes and mindset changes as well. So how can we actually ensure that public education in children actually plays a bigger role in future?
I actually picked up from what Tony mentioned, and I wrote it down. You talk about the importance of personal hygiene, about how people take that personal responsibility to change the environment to actually reduce their risk. This is actually what public education is about. In Singapore, we talk about getting people to return their trays. And of course, people would say that, oh, it's a manpower issue, and the government is trying to save money by minimizing the number of workers. Actually, how many people realize that getting the trays to be returned properly is linked to the risk to the community of avian influenza, which is what possibly Disease Acts might be driven by. And that is a form of public education. How many of our children actually knows about what goes behind the scene in terms of waste management when a cleaner cleans the street or takes the rubbish from our daily refuse chute? What happens after that? What happens in the recycling bin? I suspect many of our children or many of us adults will not know what exactly happens. And I think this ties in with actually Plenary 1, when we start thinking about a climate resilient society. All of this actually does come in, and public education of whether it is children or adult builds that platform such that subsequently, whether it is individuals or communities or societies at the workplace, if I'm a boss, but because I've been taught to play that personal responsibility, I take my lessons, I bring it to my workplace, and so hopefully my colleagues also have that responsibility towards a climate aware or a clean environment aware approach. So I do see that public education is very fundamental as we start to think about all this.
Okay, thank you, Prof. And I think, for one, just as we wrap up today's discussion, I think, for one, we actually really, it goes back to the point about how everybody needs to work together collectively. I think it starts from young, from, educating or inculcating these habits into our young children, and then, going into adulthood, and getting people, to realize that, with stakeholders from all the sectors, be it public, be it private, be it a people sector, they all actually needs to contribute towards this more prepared and more resilient ecosystem that we are in. So everyone actually has a part to play. So, we heard about, all the outcome-based contracts that, that's really necessary. We recognize the need that, there should be a need to invest in good cleaning. And of course, integration into societies as well, which Joseph mentioned earlier. The culture, although we have all different cultures, but this integration is actually very important. And of course, training, infrastructure. So all this actually works together, together with behavioral change, which actually underscores all that we are actually trying to do to gear towards a more prepared and more resilient society. So I hope that today's session has actually helped us to identify challenges and set priorities, align actions, as well as to mobilize resources for better. And thank you once again to all my panelists today. Thank you for sharing all your valuable suggestions and perspectives on how we can actually build resilience against public health threats and booster our defenses. So with that, thank you, and have a good evening ahead.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause once again for Gloria as well as our panelists, and to our virtual panelists as well. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being such a great audience. It's been a long day. However, I know that this is going to be an extremely enriching session for all of us. So please take a minute or so to fill in onto this online feedback form by scanning the QR code that we're going to cast on the screen right now for you to see. All right, so for those of you watching us for our live cast, you may scan this QR code. For those of you who are here on site with us, please take a minute to scan the QR code. we've come to the end for the CESG Catalyst 2021. We hope that we will be able to see you soon at the next CleanEnviro Summit Singapore 2022. All right, so my name is Charlene. Thank you. We'll see you next year.